The boy in the hospital pajamas suddenly lunged forward, and at that very moment ceased to be himself. The cramped hospital ward disappeared. In front of the nurse stood the very Sinclair, the same frightened little boy who had lied and now helplessly trembles before the cruel Cromer. The young man trembled all over, pleading pitifully to believe that he did not have a single penny. He desperately promised to give anything in return, while the woman enchantedly caught every word of his. This living, genuine act once again pierced her to the very bones. Every time during reading with this boy, her own self simply erased. He forced the woman to instantly become Cromer, to become a mother, to become Damien. She passively dissolved into his world and could not understand where the child got such power. And it all began far from here, under cold, indifferent stars. In this world there exist strange creatures, people with incomplete souls. They desperately reach for the light, but constantly face unprovoked disgust. The woman by the hospital bed broke down into a bitter confession. She sincerely tried to love this boy, but with each day hates him more and more. Clutching a jar of paper stars in her hands, she did not understand her own cruelty. After all, literally all living things felt hostility towards the young man. Only one dream remained: to find a way to make his soul whole. All this time the boy slept quietly. Suddenly his eyes opened wide. He silently sat on the bed in the oppressive silence of the ward. The young man exhaled a short denial with his lips alone. Barely standing on his feet, he stepped barefoot onto the cold floor. He pulled the door handle, desperately convincing himself that everything he had heard was just a lie. At that very moment, the cardio monitor began a countdown to cardiac arrest, and a dull thud of a fall was heard. Once more. 3, 2, 1, the doctor commanded sharply. The medics desperately pressed with shocks, trying to override the steady, terrifying beep of the cardio monitor. The dark-haired boy froze. The man's body on the bed twitched violently again from the defibrillator shock. However, his face under the oxygen mask remained completely motionless. A tear slipped from his eyes. The boy in the hospital pajamas stood as if paralyzed, helplessly swallowing tears. He quietly muttered that it was not true, desperately searching his mind for at least one way to fix everything. Later, the sun was already shining brightly over the large clinic building. The blonde hesitated, stopping in the corridor in front of the ward door. Sighing heavily, Kaylee ordered herself to think about the money. No one paid more than the guardian of this child, and pulled the handle. She went inside and saw the boy calmly reading a book on the bed. The woman cheerfully greeted Doyeon, hiding her true emotions behind a smile. The boy in the hospital pajamas sharply raised his gaze. Kaylee, the caregiver, approached him, gently stroked his head, and offered to read together. But up close, her face suddenly twisted with hidden nausea. She looked at him from behind and could not understand. How could such a beautiful child cause such deep disgust? There had long been rumors in the hospital about a terrifying patient whom no one wanted to treat for any money. At first, Kaylee ignored these rumors, firmly deciding to give care to a child who had suffered from evil people. She sincerely made this promise to herself, but now cold sweat was breaking out on her. The woman coughed nervously. To relieve the tension, she asked the name of the book, and the boy calmly answered, Damien. Suddenly she relaxed. The little one again seemed to her an ordinary good child. The woman suggested reading in roles, and then, dividing the lines, quietly asked if this story was true. They leaned over the pages. Of course, he suddenly exclaimed with unusual enthusiasm, raising his eyes. At this sharp shout, Kaylee shuddered, instinctively clutching her chest with her hand. Kaylee's eyes widened with genuine shock. She could not believe that the boy had really just done that. And it was at that reading that the quiet rustle of pages finally shattered the illusion. Doyeon coughed softly. The boy calmly covered the open book with his palm and casually announced that today's rehearsal was over. Suddenly, pulled out of the trance, Kaylee jumped in her chair and nodded confusedly. The woman resignedly lowered her gaze, hearing gratitude for playing along with the interlocutor. She tightly clenched her own hand, feeling as if she had just broken free from someone else's control, back into reality. A knock on the ward door instantly pulled her away from these dreadful thoughts. The door handle creaked slightly. A smiling doctor appeared in the doorway with a medical chart. He approached little Doyeon's bed and casually inquired about his well-being and walks. The boy calmly replied that he breathes the air in the park opposite every day. Then the doctor admitted that he did not come just like that. He brought important news. The man reminded Do-hyun about a mysterious patient from Korea who had exactly the same symptoms. It turned out that the sick man learned the boy's story and decided to transfer to their clinic. He was supposed to arrive in a week. Do-hyun grew gloomy, instantly guessing the real reason. The Korean's disease is rapidly progressing. The doctor nodded sadly. In the patient's homeland, they could no longer provide proper care. Therefore, they decided to send the seriously ill patient here, where doctors had long and successfully cared for Do-hyun. The plane cut through the cloudless sky when a proposal was made to meet another Korean who was to arrive next week. The autumn sun softly flooded the city skyscrapers. Little Do-hyun in a hospital pajama stood alone in the middle of the park, holding a phone. An emptiness froze in his eyes. A message from Mom with the usual dry apologies was glowing on the screen. Because of work, she and Dad again couldn't be nearby. The boy grumbled irritably that he didn't give a damn about that walk and turned back to the ward. He had just remembered another patient with the same disease who was supposed to arrive soon when someone's footsteps interrupted his thoughts. The boy raised his head in surprise. Right in front of him stood a tall man in a coat, gasping for air, clutching his chest convulsively with his hand. Do-hyun froze, staring intently at the stranger. The man was breathing heavily and sweating, barely managing to cope with the sudden attack. That very day, by chance or by the will of fate, a special bond was born between them under the golden leaves. The little boy in hospital pajamas ran up to the stranger holding his chest and anxiously offered to call for help. The man wheezed heavily, dripping with cold sweat. He sharply cut off the boy and forbade calling anyone. The boy insisted and pleaded to at least be allowed to help him get to the hospital as he saw the stranger's pain. But he waved it off, only asking to be taken to the nearest bench. As soon as he sat down on the bench, the man sighed with relief and closed his eyes. He thanked for the help and admitted that he did not expect to meet another Asian here. The stranger introduced himself as Chong Hysun and asked if the boy was Korean. The boy sincerely rejoiced at the compatriot and introduced himself as Lee Do-hyun. Settling next to him, Do-hyun asked why the new acquaintance was lying in the hospital. Hysun smiled carefreely and said that he had a rare disease that only 2 people in the world suffer from. Do-hyun thoughtfully stared at the man, suddenly realizing this was the very patient Benjamin had mentioned. Noticing this attentive gaze, Hysun decided that the boy was uncomfortable and suggested he leave. But Do-hyun quickly objected. The young man in the thrown-on coat looked around in surprise. He truly did not understand why his interlocutor should feel uncomfortable nearby. Do-hyun froze on the bench, hearing that for this boy, he was just a child. Surprise flashed in the boy's eyes. A dark memory instantly surfaced. Even his own parents were afraid to be near him. Then he stood before them, very tiny, completely unaware of his guilt. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the melody of the phone. From the receiver, Kaylee screamed in panic, demanding explanations about where he had disappeared. Do-hyun calmly replied that he was sitting in the park, although he was strictly forbidden to walk alone. He cast a sad glance aside and promised to return. The boy sincerely regretted that the conversation ended so quickly. The young man lazily threw his hands behind his head and smiled. He immediately saw through the little runaway and advised running back before even more trouble came. Hearing the shy question, the boy smiled warmly and suggested going together. Someone's finger confidently pressed the button for the 7th floor. It turned out that for both of them it was the 7th. Neighboring wards, just separated by a wall. The elevator quietly dinged. They both silently headed to their wards. The elevator stopped, and a short command to exit was heard. Looking at the stranger's back, the boy tried to understand where this unexpected calm next to him came from. The young man spoke surprisingly easily and naturally, although he could have distanced himself like everyone else. The stranger smoothly turned to the little roommate. He smiled broadly and offered to visit any time if he had no one to play with. The boy's eyes opened wide. He'd barely noticeable, but exhaled accordingly. The ward door quietly slid aside. The young man under the IV looked up in surprise. At the threshold, Do-hyun timidly fidgeted, tightly clutching a thick book to his chest. Hearing the invitation, the little one flew to the bed like a bullet. He plopped onto the mattress, still not letting go of the hiding place in his hands. The young man glanced at the golden inscription, Macbeth, and jokingly asked if the boy knew any other entertainments besides reading. The young man in hospital pajamas peeked into the little boy's book and asked in surprise if he was really interested. The boy innocently inquired if he himself did not like to read. causing the young man to awkwardly hesitate. The little one beamed with a sincere smile. The story had captivated him greatly. The young man noted that usually children prefer to play outside, inside. His younger brother also cannot stand books. The boy's face warmed as he remembered his dear peer brother. The little one skeptically retorted that with such similarity, he was hardly dear, which greatly upset the interlocutor. Suddenly the boy turned and seriously asked if the young man got along well with his brother. A brief pause hung in the air. The young man puzzledly rubbed his chin, trying to understand the purpose of the question. Lowering his eyes, the little one quietly admitted that his own brother did not like him much. He tightly gripped the book cover, regretting that Hyson was not his older brother, to which the young man asked why he loved his own so much. The young man gently smiled and asked in response if the little one had ever seen babies. Memories transported him to the past. The young man stood in the corridor and confessed that he used to not tolerate children at all because of their constant noise. But on his brother's birthday, he approached to look at the baby, just like that, without any thought in his head. The young man opened his eyes wide. He recalled the moment when he saw true beauty for the first time in his life. It was a baby, ordinary, red and wrinkled, but with an incredibly bright soul. The little ward neighbor looked up from his book in surprise, not understanding what soul was being talked about. The boy froze, catching every word. The elder smiled warmly, confessing that at that very second, he unconditionally loved his brother. The atmosphere instantly grew heavier when the little one quietly reminded the bitter truth. His own brother does not love him at all. A heavy silence hung in the ward. The child fearfully pressed his palms to his mouth, realizing he had blurted out too much. But the boy only smiled carefreely. The affection of this little one was quite enough for him. The boy blinked confusedly over his thick volume of Macbeth. The elder leaned back relaxedly against the headboard and suggested finding a more interesting activity. He agreed to play with the child, although the child only knew amusements with books. The boy blinked with big eyes and quietly explained he had spent his entire life within the walls of this hospital. Thoughts swirled in his head. Could it be that he really spent his whole life in the hospital, except for that 1 month at home, which he couldn't even remember? Hearing the rustle of the door, the man turned around in surprise at the boy. Dr. Benjamin entered the ward with a smile and greeted Do-hyun. The medic approached the bed, sincerely glad that patients with the same pain had finally met and could support each other. The man sharply held his breath and stared in amazement at the boy, who awkwardly turned away his flushed face. Realizing that the boy had been silent about his illness all this time, the patient indignantly poked him with a finger while the doctor watched the quarrel embarrassed. Do-hyun frowned. He muttered guiltily that he just hadn't found the right moment to confess, and Benjamin hurried to apologize for his tactlessness. The man squinted suspiciously and leaned over the boy, sternly asking if he was hiding something else. The boy calmly cut off, saying that he could not have any secrets since he was stuck in the hospital all the time. He lowered his gaze to the volume of Macbeth, and the interlocutor softened a little, reluctantly admitting he was right. Suddenly, a counter-question about secrets flew to the man, making him twitch nervously. He instantly flared up and loudly denied having any secrets, interrupting the nurse who had just entered the ward. While she was changing the IV drip and the doctor was making notes, the conversation died down, and Do-hyun immersed himself in reading again. In the silence of the hospital ward, a brief confirmation sounded. The nurse suddenly gasped and opened her eyes wide. With flushed cheeks, she leaned enthusiastically toward the patient, calling him Mr. Chan. The boy turned away, while the girl chattered about his fame as a famous violinist. Chan wearily closed his eyes at the request for an autograph, and his black-haired roommate responded with a silent silence. The black-haired man sharply leaned in close and burned Chan with an icy gaze, reminding him of his promise to hide nothing, so he could only laugh nervously. Do-hyun sat in the hospital ward, puffing his cheeks, and gloomily read Macbeth. The older neighbor with an awkward smile tried to justify himself, saying he did not want to deceive him. The man squinted guiltily. The boy sharply raised his eyes. Since he also hid his illness, now they were definitely even. The violinist sat down on the bed in confusion, while the boy irritably and loudly flipped through the pages. A heavy sigh. The violin left behind surfaced in memory. It had already been a year without the instrument, playing which had begun to bring only physical pain. At first, it seemed to him that he was just imagining it, until the doctor categorically forbade him to play. The man's fingers dug into the blanket until the knuckles turned white. The diagnosis was just the perfect excuse to finally quit everything. He hunched over on the bed and said that music no longer mattered, to which Do-hyun directly asked if he did not love the violin. Shadows fell on the man's face, and he snapped that he took up the instrument without pleasure and regretted nothing, ignoring the boy's reproach about the fame gained. Yes, he confirmed dully under the child's cold gaze. Do-hyun turned to the window and admitted that he would never understand adults who stubbornly deny what they are sincerely attached to. And these words struck the violinist like an electric shock. The man on the bed froze in surprise. To his words about excessive self-confidence, the boy calmly replied, "They both have something they sincerely love." For him, it was an acting game. The little one clenched his fist, confessing that the more he played, the more he suffered. But he could not live without the stage, so he was sure that the man felt the same. The boy stood up. He saw it in his eyes. The man still passionately loved the violin. Heading to the door, the little one did not understand why he was lying to himself. He pressed his hands to his chest. Now he had to prove to him what it means to give your whole self to your favorite craft. The stage instantly drowned in the eerie darkness of Shakespeare's Macbeth. The sinister witch prophesied the main character the royal throne. Blinded by the promised power, Macbeth and his wife dared to kill the king. The boy stared in horror at his own bloodied hand and screamed wildly. The bloody reckoning for greed had begun. He desperately rubbed his bloodied palms, shouting for the cursed stain to finally disappear. Suddenly, the boy in the hospital pajamas froze over the sink. He sharply turned around with a terrifying, unfocused gaze. In his mind, a wild thought struck. Who would have thought there was so much blood in the old man? The little boy stood in a huge bloody puddle, right in the middle of the ward, while the young man on the bed watched in a daze. He was pierced by icy horror. It was true madness. Behind the boy loomed a dark female shadow, as if the devil himself had possessed the child. Suddenly the boy rasped wildly and grabbed his throat with both hands. The echo of a foreign voice warned that their fear would destroy everything. The little one collapsed helplessly onto the floor, and the young man instantly jumped out of bed shouting, "Do-hyun!" He firmly grabbed the confused child by the shoulders. The young man asked in shock what was happening to him. He fully understood that it was just a game, but he could no longer watch this horror. The little one anxiously asked if he was not scared, and the man waved off embarrassedly. You can't hit a child to bring him to his senses. The man sighed heavily and openly admitted his defeat to the surprised boy. He confessed that he simply could not stand aside watching such a game. A quiet step forward. The steps confidently moved toward the ward. The ward door creaked open, and he appeared on the threshold. Inside, everything tightened at one question. How could he even live without his violin? He took the instrument out of the case and confidently stood opposite the boy. The bow touched the strings, and the space instantly filled with magic. The boy held his breath, enchanted, looking at the glowing notes in the air. The melody was so alive that it lay like warm light right on his hands. The boy felt it instantly, the man's uncontrollable, desperate desire to play. The violinist led the bow with a gentle smile, putting all his determination into this moment. The violinist played in the hospital room, finally realizing the bitter truth. He stopped by the child's bed. The boy held his breath. The man did not lower the bow, acknowledging the terrible fact. They had the same illness. Suddenly the air was torn by a flash, and someone's joyful shout about found strange souls. A floating bullet hung in the middle of the room, sincerely amazed by such a meeting. The man tensed instantly. The uninvited guest hurried to explain that higher beings are usually forbidden from interfering in human lives. The boy asked again, but the sphere quickly brushed off the details. The creature decided to adhere to human etiquette. The space was flooded with dazzling rainbow light. The unknown declared himself the coordinator. The sphere carelessly twirled near the window, acknowledging that this title was not very accurate. She accidentally read the thoughts of the shocked boy and allowed herself to be called simply the cluster. The older brother frowned, focusing on the main point. The guest had just called them both strange souls. The boy thoughtfully raised his gaze, realizing that he and his brother had something in common, the same illness. Therefore, the mysterious strange soul could explain everything. Suddenly, the room was illuminated by a magical flash, and the invisible interlocutor joyfully confirmed the guess, praising the boy's intelligence. The voice advised the man nearby not to tense up, because today there would only be a conversation. to which he cautiously asked about the topic. The question sounded like a blow. Is it true that both of them were always pushed away by other people without reason? A vision of a sunny forest flashed before the eyes, and the essence added that absolutely all living things feel the same hostility towards them. The man shuddered and nervously tugged at the edge of his hospital pants. The mysterious guest finally revealed the cards. The whole point is that they were born with defective souls. The world around is perfect, but very rarely a fatal glitch occurs and mutants appear. The dark silhouette of the boy was torn apart by purple lightning. This was the very defect. The light struck again, and the voice declared directly, "These mutants, it is them." The boy's face was half hidden in the shadow from the shock experienced. All the pieces instantly fell into place. This is why his parents did not love him, and the nurses constantly ran away, unable to cope with him. The little one sat alone on the hospital bed in semi-darkness, recalling his vain hopes for someone's warmth and love. Before meeting his older brother, none of his wishes ever came true. The familiar world shattered into pieces from the realization. All his suffering was only because of the stigma of a strange soul. A voice from the mysterious, glowing sphere outside the window finally revealed the truth. The doctors could not heal them, because the problem lay in an unstable soul that was literally tearing the body apart from within. For the sake of survival, their bodies mutated. Thus, the younger one developed an incomprehensible talent, and the elder became a brilliant violinist. In moments of creative trance, this radiant talent made their defective souls almost perfect. The brothers silently stood in the middle of the ward, realizing the scale of their unprecedented gift. Usually, the body simply could not withstand such a load, and the person died. But the appearance of this entity changed everything. To the violinist's direct question, the sphere answered dryly. They had violated the natural order of the universe, and now fell under its jurisdiction. The young man's face darkened with tension when he learned about the true mission of the coordinator, to extract defective souls from bodies for the sake of balance. For ordinary people, this meant certain death. But now, suddenly, another path appeared. The elder brother placed his hand on the younger's shoulder and irritably ordered the entity not to waste time and to get to the point. The young man's eyes widened sharply. The coordinator declared that he had found a way not to kill them. The sphere blinded the room with a powerful flash and promised to make their souls perfect, but immediately cut off the phrase with a troubling "but." The man pierced him with a tense look and sharply interrupted. He would choose only one of them. The boy in the hospital gown froze, his eyes widening in shock. The boy in the hospital pajamas froze in surprise. A voice from nowhere declared that souls can be saved without violating the laws of nature. A dazzling light promised to transform an incomplete soul into a whole one. But the promise came at a cruel price. The chance was given to only one. The little one froze in shock. The question hung in the air. Why can't both be saved? The voice cut off. They were incredibly lucky to snatch even one life from death. The probability of encountering two broken souls in one place was 0. Moreover, their energies turned out to be so similar that they entered into a powerful resonance. The entity admitted it was seeing this for the first time in its entire existence. The young man looked hard at the child. The soul of one had to fill the voids of the other, forever merging into a single whole. They would never be their former selves again. However, the one whose will takes the initiative during the fusion will be able to fully preserve their personality. A decision had to be made immediately. The boy had just involuntarily used his hidden talent, and the cracks in their souls began to rapidly expand. The glow warned that this unique ability was given to them not by chance. An unknown voice in the ward explained, "Talent perfects the soul, but mercilessly cripples the body." Their last burst of energy was so powerful that the entity was able to find them. This power literally turned their unstable souls inside out. The verdict was harsh. They had shortened their own lives with their own hands. The source of the voice was a dazzling glow hanging right above the hospital bed. Do-hyun asked fearfully about the cost, and the voice replied that the child's body was almost unharmed. The whole problem lay with the adult. His body would not hold up and would fall apart before the end of this year. The man froze in shock upon learning that their recent performance had just burned a whole year of his life. Do-hyun was paralyzed by guilt, as he was the one who forcibly handed the violin to someone who had long sworn off playing. He himself pushed him into the grave. The boy said in a choked voice that it all happened because of him. The man sharply grabbed Dokyeon by the shoulders and firmly stated that it was exclusively his own choice. Even a step away from death, he thought only about how to calm the boy. The boy raised his gaze and firmly decided to take all the responsibility upon himself. "Save my brother, please," he begged in the hospital ward. The elder indignantly insisted that he was fine, but the boy reminded him he has a beloved younger brother. The boy's gaze fell on the open violin. He acknowledged that his brother is an outstanding musician known worldwide. The elder desperately exclaimed that it doesn't matter at all right now, but the boy calmly objected. The brother has something to lose. The young man turned pale, hearing from the child that she herself has nothing to lose, as she has achieved nothing yet. With a gentle smile, the boy made a terrible conclusion. It is better for the elder to survive. He gently covered his hands with his own. The child quietly added that he most wants to see his brother alive, because he is a good person. The elder tightly hugged the younger, amazed that such adult words came from a child's lips. Suddenly, a magical flash burst from the violin. A mysterious entity warned that a decision must be made quickly, otherwise the body will be destroyed. The young man gathered his thoughts and asked about the time. The voice replied that they have about a week. Looking into the sunny window, the brother agreed to postpone the final choice for these 7 days. A dazzling flash tore the space. The mysterious coordinator agreed to fulfill their request as an exception. In the quiet hospital ward, the elder brother knelt before the younger. He tightly hugged the boy, accepting the harsh condition. They were given exactly 1 week. Suddenly he bowed low and firmly declared that he would not take his brother's life for his own salvation. The younger was stunned by shock. The brother assured, "When the time runs out, they will again demand another way out." Dokyeon anxiously stared into the darkness, doubting that this exit even existed. What if it doesn't exist? The elder gently placed his hands on his shoulders, stopping the growing panic. He asked him to cast away heavy thoughts and simply enjoy each day of the given week. A sudden change of topic. With a warm smile, the brother looked him in the eyes and unexpectedly asked if Dokyeon had ever seen a real performance. The boy only confusedly pressed his hands to his chest, not understanding the purpose of the question. The boy looked around with admiration, walking down the street next to the young man. They froze in front of the monumental theater building, impressed by its size. While the boy bought tickets, the little one waited impatiently nearby. In the hall, he awkwardly settled into a huge red armchair. The light suddenly went out. The spotlight beam caught the figures of the actors on the stage. The boy's heart pounded, his cheeks flushed with a blush. He was seeing someone else's play live for the first time in his life. Changing faces, ringing voices, and even the actors' breathing instantly created the atmosphere. The boy sat without breathing. The magic of the theater completely absorbed him. The young man glanced at him and smiled contentedly. He mentally praised himself for the idea of bringing the boy here. Stepping outside, the boy waved his hands energetically, sharing his impressions. And by the food kiosk, his eyes lit up again when the older one ordered 2 servings of hot treats. The evening sky was densely studded with stars. The boy silently looked at the young man with the massive case on his back. It was time to go home, although he did not want to say goodbye to the cheerful day at all. They stopped near a familiar park bench. Memories flooded in immediately. It was here that they met for the first time, when the little one could barely stand, and the young man helped him. The elder gently suggested he sit down. The boy obediently settled on the boards. Suddenly he froze and opened his eyes wide. The young man took out a violin and smiled warmly, noting that they had been apart for too long. He added that he would never part with him again. The musician gallantly bowed, greeting his only listener at the personal performance of violinist Jeon Hee-sun. The little one's cheeks flushed with joy, and he clapped his hands in delight. Jeon Hee-sun closed his eyes and with a gentle smile led the bow. The young man played the violin in the middle of the autumn park, surrounded by the magical glow of notes. Eyes closed, on his face, absolute calm. With the bow in his hands, he himself resembled a living embodiment of music. The melody began like a dim ember, but flared up to a powerful final crescendo. He opened his eyes and smiled broadly, freely giving himself fully to the playing. The younger brother on the bench simply froze with his mouth open. The bow stopped, and the young man exhaled heavily, lowering the violin. Sweat rolled down his flushed face. A single clap. The violinist looked around confusedly. He hadn't even noticed how a crowd had gathered around, now sincerely applauding. The little one exhaled in delight that his brother was simply incredible. He abruptly grabbed the boy by the wrist, making him squeak in surprise. Hiding the instrument, The young man pulled his brother away into the night darkness towards the hospital, throwing in on the go that extra recognition would bring them a lot of trouble. The panting man dragged the boy along the evening street, pressing a massive black case to himself as he walked. Both were gasping for air, stopping only in the hospital corridor. And then they couldn't hold back and burst into ringing laughter. The happy time flew by unnoticed. Now the young man sat alone in the hospital room, hunched over at the edge of the bed. Suddenly he raised his gaze. The promised time had come. The boy in the hospital pajamas looked confusedly at the large guitar case. The older young man explained with a smile that this instrument was custom-made, his personal gift. The little one clung tightly to the case and quietly admitted that such kindness made him nurture vain illusions. He bitterly added that even despite the threat of imminent death, still desperately continues to hope for the future. The days spent together outside the hospital still seemed to the child like a bright dream. Living next to this boy turned out to be much more interesting, tastier, and more fun than he could have imagined. Suddenly the elder got up from the bed and decisively declared, if the younger refuses to accept his soul, then he prefers to die together with him. A ringing silence hung in the ward. The younger was embarrassed, expecting anger, but the young man only sighed resignedly, accepting his silence. Suddenly the elder's eyes widened in shock. The boy admitted with surprise that it was strange to hear about hope for the future from someone who until recently had no reason to live. The man smiled faintly. That was quite enough for him, too. The younger quietly thanked his brother. Suddenly his eyes began to close from unexpected fatigue. Dokyeon weakly fell onto his chest. The elder anxiously called him by name. At that very moment, a dazzling rainbow light flashed outside the window. The man asked if the guest had cast sleep on the boy, and he confirmed. Otherwise, it would have been too awkward. The glow turned into a magical sphere right on the blanket, and the man calmly stroked his sleeping brother and threw into the air that it was very kind of him. His gaze instantly became sterner when he asked if the guest had perhaps changed his mind. He lowered his eyes heavily, silently waiting for an answer. The action shifted to a week earlier, to the dark window of the hospital. Then he sat in the ward all alone, wrapped in the night darkness. With a tear on his cheek, he quietly addressed the cluster with a final request. Suddenly, a blinding light flashed behind his back. The clot was outraged. He was not some tame dog to come running at the first call. The boy lowered his gaze guiltily and asked for one thing: to save Dokyeon in a week. The firefly reproached that the brothers did not value their own lives at all, but the young man bitterly objected. He looked at his palm, still remembering the warm heat of the violin he had recently taken up after a long break. Grabbing his head, he confessed in despair that he had already dreamed of their happy future together. A moment flashed in his imagination, where he firmly held the child's hand. Kneeling before his brother, he squeezed his shoulders. The little one still had something to lose, and he himself had gained nothing. The boy only smiled silently and warmly. This could not be the end for the child. He wanted that someday this child's hands would not hold all that was acquired, and that the moment would come when the child would regret saying goodbye to life. He firmly decided to give his brother a chance at a real life. After all, he himself had lived a little longer. He was sitting on a hospital bed, looking at the glowing sphere and bitterly reflecting. In his 28 years, he had tasted far more dishes than that boy. The sphere pulsed dazzlingly, while he realized a terrible detail. The kid probably had never even eaten ordinary chicken. The man turned away to the night window, recalling that the young man's world was always limited to the ward walls, without any travels or entertainments. He barely smiled at his thoughts. Suddenly the room was covered by a dark aura, and a foreign voice declared unequivocally that dying like this was wrong. The man shuddered from surprise. To the question of the invisible entity, he firmly answered. His name was Chan Hyson. At that very moment, a powerful flash of light tore the space. Someone forcefully pulled the hospital stretcher. The unknown person thoughtfully repeated his name, and Hyson tensed. The voice from the darkness promised to give him a last gift before fulfilling the request. Someone's keen gaze pierced him through. The mysterious interlocutor promised to stop the time of Hyson's soul for the rest of his life. The light flashed with new strength, and the voice ordered to live the allotted days truly joyfully. Sparks of magic slowly dissolved into the air, leaving behind a quiet gratitude. Kaizen sat on the bed with a peaceful smile, acknowledging, thanks to this gift, he finally managed to fully enjoy life. A shining essence suddenly appeared nearby, and asked if he was really ready to survive at the cost of this baby's life. The man glanced at the sleeping boy while the spirit inquired whether he feared its hatred after awakening. He only smiled sadly, to which the spirit ironically remarked that they were both still just children. Suddenly the man asked to be taken not now, but at least in a few hours. It's simple. The baby will be terrified to death if he wakes up next to a corpse. He did not want to leave such a horror in his brother's memory. Let the little one just finish sleeping and wake up as usual. He gently stroked the child's head. The spirit noted that the man thought only of the little one until his last breath. Probably their souls resonated too well. This compatibility turned out to be simply phenomenal. His soul blazed like a fierce sunset, while the boy's aura resembled a cold, endless sea. Mixing two such elements would be impossible, if not for this absolutely incredible coincidence. The man smiled warmly and admitted that at first he thought the same. But now, watching the sleeping Dokyeon, he knew for sure. They were connected not by chance, but by fate itself. The shining sphere responded only ironically. Probably, before inevitable death, everyone is drawn to sentimentality. The magical cluster unexpectedly agreed. Something very strange was indeed happening with these two. Unique coincidences layered one upon another, breaking the usual order. This is what the higher essence called fate. In the bright ward, the man sat on a hospital bed, and nearby a little boy peacefully slept, leaning against his feet. An invisible voice was surprised by the man's sudden kindness to the unfortunate soul, then ordered to wake Dokyeon and just play along with the child, closing his eyes to everything. The man barely smiled, bitterly ironic that now he would also have to become an actor. The air sparkled with soft light. The boy sleepily blinked, hearing a quiet call to wake up. Dokyeon suddenly jumped up, frightened by his own dream, while the shining sphere silently hung over the bed again. The child panicked. She was afraid that they had wasted this day and had not managed to ask the most important thing. The man closed his eyes and quietly assured that they had not asked anything yet. The boy timidly turned back to the magical cluster. He had to know for sure whether there really was no way for both of them to survive. The entity's answer sounded like a merciless verdict. Only one would survive, or both would die. The room plunged into oppressive darkness, leaving the two doomed to sit alone with the glowing sphere. Fists clenched the hospital pajamas until they turned white. The little one sighed resignedly that he would simply live out the allotted time, and that would be the end. The elder sharply cut in that no one would die alone, so they did not need anyone else's help. The glowing entity, calling itself the coordinator, warned that it would not act by force, and advised not to regret their refusal. With a flash of light, the guest dissolved into the air, leaving the brothers alone. The elder addressed Doyeon, asking if he remembered the past words of that cluster. He looked intently at the little one, waiting for an answer. The boy lowered his eyes and quietly said that he had about 3 weeks left to live. Dokyeon suddenly lunged forward, but the brother suddenly pressed his hand to his own chest. Suddenly the elder apologized for becoming a worthless person, through whom the little one would experience the pain of loss. He bitterly added that he now felt exactly that way. The elder quietly warned, it would be painful, it would be hard, it would be so lonely and bitter that one would want to die. No! Dokyeon exclaimed in despair, refusing even to hear that he might hate him. The elder brother smiled warmly, asking not to say such words. He firmly squeezed little Dokyeon's hand and suggested making one promise. Sitting on the hospital bed, he ordered the little one to live his life to the very end, because just living is not enough. He asked his brother to be happy with all his might. Dokyeon hid his gaze in the shadow, admitting that he had no strength for it. But the elder only extended his pinky and gently insisted on his own. The younger hooked his pinky with his and promised. Outside the window floated a calm blue sky. The boy hesitantly froze in the doorway of the ward. He quietly asked if they would see each other tomorrow, to which the brother smiled jokingly. Dokyeon pressed his hand to his chest and smiled sincerely, with hope. Suddenly, someone in hospital slippers stepped forward, quietly calling Dokyeon. The younger stopped at the threshold of the hospital ward, while the elder brother wished him a good night. He smiled warmly and promised that from tomorrow, all their days would be only happy. The boy joyfully wished him the same, until suddenly the silence was broken by the continuous beeping of the cardio monitor. The face under the oxygen mask froze, motionless. Brother's hand fell powerless, and in the little one's eyes froze a silent horror, and tears boiled up.
Liar,
he bitterly whispered over the motionless body. This is a story about the difficult path from a child nobody needed to a global star. Director, I don't want to be in the same room with him, hysterically sounded from behind the door addressed to Jun Hee-sun. The boy himself calmly sat on the chair. He had long been used to people refusing to be near him. His life began when as a baby he was thrown into the second toilet stall at Namguro Station. Die! A dull blow sharply broke the silence. Two older boys mercilessly beat the little one with their feet, right on the street, demanding he never show up before them again. The attackers raged. Why did he come back again, if he had already been adopted? Pressed to the asphalt, the boy himself would have liked to know that. Thoughts abruptly stopped. His pupils dilated from the painful memory. A solid man recently took him away before his eyes, swearing to take responsibility for his whole life. And then this adult simply ran away, easily abandoning the child like discarded garbage. Hee-sun clenched his t-shirt on his chest until his knuckles turned white. In the whole world, he was absolutely needed by no one. Life for him had always been a merciless jungle, where he survived on pure malice. The boy unhesitatingly threw punches in dark alleys, cruelly defending himself from other children, until strangers pointed at the beaten boy, saying they wanted to take him away. And then one day, everything suddenly changed. In his gray, hopeless days, a friendly couple suddenly appeared, radiating sincere warmth. The boy coldly refused, being sure that any adoption would end with another betrayal. He turned away into the darkness, saying he was fed up with these senseless family games. But the couple did not give up. The woman, with a gentle smile, handed him a huge teddy bear, greeting Hee-sun. The boy was stunned by the surprise. Sweets, gifts, and new clothes were incessantly pouring down on him. And this prickly, frightened hedgehog gradually began to get used to such treatment. From gentle touches, the ice in his soul melted, releasing a long-buried hope. Hee-sun tightly hugged the gifted toy to his chest. With fragile faith that everything would be fine with these people, he took their hands and took a step towards the light. There was no point in hoping for the best. Cold night skyscrapers towered outside the window. The boy tiptoed through the dark living room, pressing a jar of paper stars to his chest. He sincerely believed that this homemade surprise would comfort his eternally busy foster parents. The step froze before the half-open bedroom door, from which suddenly came the hysterical scream of the mother. She demanded to return the child back. The boy turned to stone. Light fell on his pale face, while the woman in despair confessed that she felt only disgust towards him. She cried on her husband's shoulder, begging to remove the stranger from her home. The father calmly cut off. He could not give away his son due to public condemnation, so he would simply have to support him financially and pretend he did not exist. The child silently listened to this sentence in the dark corridor. The colorful gift flew with a crash to the bottom of the trash bin. The boy was breathing heavily, clutching the edge of the table in his room until his knuckles turned white. In his wide-open eyes flashed an icy determination. He would put on the mask of the perfectly obedient son. Since no one welcomed him anywhere, he would squeeze everything out of these people to the last drop, starting with impeccable school grades. Time passed and the teenager realized excellent grades alone were not enough. A much more reliable plan was needed. The boy opened his eyes in surprise. What could it be? He shifted his gaze to his mother, who was sitting exhausted at the table near the wooden case. Once she had passionately dreamed of becoming a famous violinist. A heavy, doomed sigh escaped from her lips. Realizing the limits of her talent, she gave up and compromised with the harsh reality, resigned herself to the fate of an ordinary person. And at that very moment, the child understood how to act. He took the instrument and played, so that his mother turned around in shock. She covered her mouth with her palms, not believing her own eyes. An incredible, innate gift awakened in her son. Multiplied by a hellish amount of practice, this talent turned him into a true comet in the world of music. The boy instantly conquered the audience and easily took the title of the youngest performer. Years flew by. The child grew up and became a stately young man on the big stage. But he did not leave the violin for a second, because he had to somehow continue living. Under the loud ovations of the faceless crowd, he continued to play, just to survive. Sweating and painfully squinting, he pulled every note out of himself to the last drop of strength. Life was abruptly put on pause at the doors of the university hospital. The doctor left no choice. Urgent hospitalization was necessary. The boy heard a terrible verdict. He was diagnosed with a rare disease. Finding himself in the ward, he heavily placed the case on the bed, painfully realizing that he would have to give up the violin. Emptiness froze in his eyes. He had long come to terms with the fact that people would forget him because of the illness, but losing the music as well turned out to be unbearable. Looking at the instrument, he bitterly asked himself since when this violin had come to mean so much. His hand gently touched the case. There was no point in searching for an answer anymore. With a dull click of the door, he hid the instrument in the closet. He loosened the violin strings and long hospital days began, where his only company was a similarly sick little boy. Sun rays indifferently pierced through the tall windows of the ward. Time stopped for him. He remained motionless, lying under the IV drip, cut off from the whole world by a cold glass wall. The exhausted young man barely smiled, whispering that for such a "this is quite a good ending," while the stunned doctor stared shockingly at the screen of his tablet. What was happening to little Do-hyun could not be explained otherwise than as a true miracle. The doctor enthusiastically reported that the indicators were steadily rising, as if by someone's powerful magic. The oppressive, sticky feeling of horror that constantly dragged the child down had vanished without a trace. The current Do-hyun just silently sat on the bed, radiating absolute calm. The deadly disease had almost receded, leaving behind a quiet, obedient boy. The medic gently advised him to change the environment. Do-hyun calmly asked again if he was really being discharged, and the doctor confirmed. The hospital walls could no longer help. However, a heavy anxiety lay in the man's gaze, for the real danger was hidden not in physical health. Everything was worse. The boy was breaking down psychologically. After the death of his roommate, Jong Hee-sun, the little boy finally closed himself off. He abandoned his favorite books and now spent whole days either sleeping or studying the window with an empty gaze, forcing the doctor to immediately call his parents. And outside the window, the clear, carefree sky continued to float. The doctor asked if the boy wanted to call first, but he refused and asked to do it instead of him. Deciding not to delay any longer, he informed that he would contact the parents, and soon a bright building of the city hospital appeared before them. The couple silently got out of the yellow taxi. The woman walked beside the man, anxiously pressing her hands to herself. The morning sun illuminated the facade of the clinic. The woman froze by the coffee machine. The voice on the receiver had just announced the confirmation of patient Lee Do-hyun's discharge. "What discharge?" she asked in shock. The doctor assured that this was not a temporary improvement, but a complete cure from a rare disease. For 8 long years she had prepared for the worst, but instead heard about a miracle. Miss So covered her mouth with her hand, barely holding back a flood of emotions. However, the doctor sharply brought her back to reality. Physically healthy Do-hyun was in a deep psychological crisis. Anxiety flashed in the woman's eyes. The death of a close friend was a devastating blow for the boy, forcing him to escape the pain into constant sleep. Now exhausted Do-hyun was quietly sleeping in the ward, desperately needing family support. So cautiously inquired whether the boy mentioned his mother and father. Hearing a dry no, she clenched her fist until her knuckles turned white. Swallowing the bitterness, the woman promised to coordinate the discharge day with her husband. Later, standing next to him in the elevator, she coldly cut off, saying she had already decided to stay in America. The woman smiled gently, calming her husband. The doctors still did not understand the reason for her sudden recovery, but there were still 6 months of mandatory examinations ahead in the USA. Making her way through the crowded corridor, she was worried, as a 9-year-old child could not be left alone in America. The woman swallowed nervously. She was about to live under the same roof with her own son for the first time. Anxiety about their shared future gave her no peace. Sunlight flooded the quiet ward. The boy looked at the empty bed, still not believing the reality of what was happening. With a massive case on his back, he realized that he was finally leaving these hospital walls. There was a knock on the door, and he calmly allowed entry. The door leaf quietly ajar. His parents appeared on the threshold. The boy met them with an absolutely cold, piercing gaze. The adults instantly froze, staring at their son in confusion. In the tense silence, the heart beat loudly. The heart thudded loudly, and her pupils sharply dilated with horror. She helplessly sank to the floor, clutching the man's sleeve, while before them stood the boy with the case on his back. A panic thought pierced her consciousness. She suddenly realized what she had done to her own child. It was Do-hyun, her only son, whom they had not seen for so long. The father asked dryly if he had packed his things, and the boy calmly confirmed. Looking at the broken mother, the boy suddenly whispered quietly, Sorry. The woman finally broke down, covered her face with her hand, and sobbed bitterly, begging to be forgiven. Through tears, she repeated that only the mother was to blame for everything. Do-yeon opened his eyes in surprise. He immediately objected, saying that the problem had always been with him. While the father held his wife by the shoulders, the little boy matter-of-factly explained that everything happened because of his nature, and they could do nothing about it. He calmly finished by saying that everything was fine. The woman shuddered and, in a state of deep shock, bit her finger. The woman, in despair, sat down on the floor, not understanding how this could have happened, while the boy with the violin on his back silently towered over her. Drenched in tears, she begged for an explanation of how he could not blame them at all. "Do I have to?" he replied coldly. Not a single muscle twitched on his youthful face. A short, confused question flashed in the boy's head, while the parents convulsively held on to each other. He looked at the adults and sincerely did not understand where so much despair on their faces came from. Later, the three of them silently crossed the sunlit street. Near the yellow taxi, a woman carefully and somewhat uncertainly touched his shoulder. Golden autumn, an empty park bench, and complete silence. In the boy's memory, the same park surfaced. Then, in a hospital gown, he sat here next to his brother. The sun was just as softly breaking through the crimson leaves. The brother slowly approached the bench, hiding a violin behind his back. Emerging from memories, he looked ahead and quietly informed his brother about his discharge, after which he turned around and confidently walked away. Sitting in the back seat of the car, he clung tightly to the violin case, catching a strange, alien warmth through his own anxiety. It felt like an echo of the brother's emotions, who invisibly comforted and assured that everything was fine. But he only gloomily lowered his head. Nothing could be good anymore. The woman beside him noticed his hands and calmly asked about the case. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror and asked if the boy could play. He was really sure he could. After all, he inherited Hyson's life, who had honed this skill for years. But the truth hit him hard. He couldn't play at all. It was Hyson's life, not his own. And these bitter thoughts were sharply interrupted by the woman, who started talking about a new home. Looking out the window, she said that in America they would settle in a quiet neighborhood right by the sea. And then she added that he would go to elementary school there. And at these words, the boy shuddered. The woman smiled gently, reminding him that after being discharged from the hospital, it was absolutely necessary to study. He froze confusedly in his seat, gripping the violin tighter. She explained that the semester had already started, but thanks to hospital lessons, he would be promoted immediately to the 2nd grade. From such an unexpected prospect of a normal life, his cheeks instantly flushed with a deep blush. The taxi stopped on a quiet street. The boy thought with relief that he had indeed been discharged from the hospital. He took a cautious step towards the woman. The boy with the massive case on his back blinked in surprise. In front of him shone a huge modern mansion with a swimming pool, and the woman gently explained that they had only brought the main furniture so far. She asked if they could buy the rest tomorrow, and the boy calmly agreed. He moved towards the bed, pulling the case off his shoulders, while the adults silently and tensely watched his back. The boy barely turned at her timid question about dinner. The man asked kindly if he needed anything else, but received a muffled no. The adults promised to sort out the rest of the things themselves, and left him in the room. The boy quietly said he would go to sleep, and the parents immediately nodded hastily. Suddenly, the woman abruptly stopped at the doorway. With hope in her voice, she timidly asked if she could come to wake him up tomorrow morning. The boy stood with his back to her, and she froze by the door, afraid to take an extra step. Do-yeon froze in confusion. The woman opposite nervously clenched her palms, anxiously looking into his face. She gently explained that now they would live together, so she needed time to get used to it. Wishing a good night, she promised to wake the boy in the morning. The door quietly closed, and he was left alone in the spacious, semi-dark room. Approaching the window, he slightly pulled back the curtain. The new house, the first school in his life, everything around seemed completely strange and unusual. The night silence filled the space. Do-yeon thoughtfully looked at his palm, remembering that this new life was given to him by his brother Hyson. But how exactly to live on, he still did not know. The morning flooded the facade of the modern suburban house with sunlight. The woman exhaled heavily, climbing the dark stairs. She ajar the door to the room and froze in surprise. On the perfectly made bed sat Do-yeon. The boy had long since woken up and was fully dressed. The mother smiled warmly and suggested going down for breakfast, then going shopping. Do-hyun calmly agreed. Soon the family found themselves on the sunlit streets of a bustling city. In the shopping center, the father enthusiastically twirled a frying pan in his hands in front of his surprised wife. The boy's attention was drawn to something else. He froze in front of the wide glass window of a bookstore. The mother gave a stern glance at the man, reminding him of the long list of necessary items. While the father obediently went shopping with the cart, she suggested her son look at the books. Inside, endless shelves awaited them, up to the very ceiling. Do-hyun's eyes gleamed with excitement. Only now did he realize how meager his old hospital library was compared to this place. The boy eagerly rummaged between the bookshelves until his gaze caught on the science fiction section. On the recommendations of the month stand, the needed copy was proudly displayed. Joyfully grabbing the find, the boy abruptly turned around and ran full speed into a tall young man. Books clattered to the floor. Falling frightened to his knees, the boy began to gather the scattered books, when suddenly he heard a cold, "Hey," above him. He looked up in confusion. The young man in the green jacket looked down at him, irritably demanding an apology for the collision. The boy silently froze before the stranger. His eyes suddenly widened in shock. He sharply bowed and apologized so loudly that the boy flinched and recoiled. All the bully's pride instantly vanished, and he awkwardly asked if the child was hurt. Instead of tears, huge, absolutely innocent eyes looked at him, literally sparkling. The young man was completely stunned, mentally wondering at the strange behavior of modern children. And the funniest thing was that he himself deliberately put himself in the way of the collision. He was simply annoyed by the little one's fuss, and he intended to bring him to tears. The boy with the icy gaze measured the little one, immediately noticing the expensive clothes on him. He moved on, deciding that they were not on the same path. This schoolboy seemed like a person from another world. No emotions on the face. He threw out a parting remark so that the boy would forget about it and leave, and indifferently passed by the surprised little one. The little one turned around confusedly, when suddenly a worried woman ran up to him. She forced a smile, hiding her fear, and asked about the chosen books. The woman convinced herself not to meddle in children's affairs, but anxiety for Do-hyun prevailed, so she cautiously suggested putting several volumes back on the shelf. In response, the boy only pressed the heavy stack to his chest more tightly and fearfully. "No, this is not enough," he blurted out, to which the woman gently reminded him about the huge empty office at home, for which many more purchases needed to be made. Do-hyun's eyes lit up, and with puppy-like excitement, he asked again if it was really possible to fill the entire room with books. The woman leaned toward him warmly. His cheeks flushed with happiness when she allowed him to choose more and suggested having lunch at a famous nearby restaurant. Soon they were calmly having lunch together at a table for 3, with a cart nearby filled to the brim with new purchases. During lunch at the restaurant, the mother casually reminded the father about his 6 o'clock flight, causing the boy to sharply raise his eyes. The father explained apologetically that he was returning to Korea alone. Due to work matters, they could not stay together. The mother calmly confirmed that she would live in America, to which Do-hyun asked worriedly if she was really okay with that. She smiled gently and assured him that it was her own decision, so there was nothing to worry about. The boy silently lowered his eyes, and the conversation ended there. The sun reflected off the glass facades of San Francisco International Airport. In the terminal hall, the parents said goodbye, asking each other to take care and stay in touch. The man took his suitcase and headed for boarding, but hesitated for a moment. Do-hyun was staring intently at his back. "Be healthy," the father smiled warmly, turning around one last time. The passenger plane took off into the evening sky, and the boy silently watched it with his gaze. He stood in place for a long time, looking into the heights. The door creaked quietly, and a stripe of bright morning sun fell on the carpet of the dark bedroom. He fell helplessly onto the bed, sighing heavily after the crazy day. Without his brother, the days dragged unbearably, and the promise given to him to live a long life became harder and harder to keep. By the table stood a prepared backpack with a cover. A new school awaited him the next day. His gaze darkened with a dull pain. His brother had given his own soul for his salvation. The boy tightly closed his eyes, not understanding if he was really worth such a terrible sacrifice. On a clear morning, cheerful greetings were already sounding within the walls of the majestic school building. The teacher joyfully clapped her hands, announcing to the class the arrival of a new friend. The students at their desks shouted agreement in unison. The woman smiled warmly at the door. Having received permission, He timidly stepped over the threshold of the sunlit office. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. He was at school for the first time in his life, and was terribly afraid he wouldn't manage. The teacher by the board joyfully asked the students to warmly welcome the newcomer from the harmony class. She smiled kindly toward the corridor. The door gently slid open, and a calm boy with deep blue eyes appeared on the threshold. He clenched the backpack straps until his knuckles turned white. His heart was wildly pounding from excitement before his first school day ever. The class froze, and the blonde girl in front even quietly exhaled in surprise. The teacher encouragingly placed her hand on his shoulder and asked him to introduce himself. Do-yeon was momentarily confused, as he was under the scrutiny of so many gazes for the first time. Remembering that people had only avoided him before, he sharply gave a dry, official greeting, even naming the exact address of his new home. The teacher nervously swallowed, absolutely not expecting such formality from the child. However, the classmates perceived his speech as a real business presentation and were completely delighted by the seriousness of the newcomer. With an awkward smile, the teacher sent him to the only free seat at the back of the classroom. He silently walked to his desk amid the interested whispers of the children. As soon as the boy sat down, a blonde girl in front abruptly turned around and happily introduced herself as Jean Lacey, and her neighbor as Nicholas. At a brief greeting from Do-yeon, the neighbor awkwardly hesitated and added that friends usually just call him Nick. Blonde Nikki kindly allowed the interlocutor to call him by his name. His gaze slid sideways with displeasure. All the girls' attention instantly shifted to the newcomer, and this greatly annoyed Nikki. The female classmates enthusiastically asked the boy about his luxurious house, and he calmly confirmed that he has a swimming pool. Nikki twitched in place from surprise. All jealousy disappeared. He fixed his gaze on the opponent's back, while the neighbor happily revealed his main weakness, a love of swimming. With a blush on his cheeks and a sparkle in his eyes, Nikki timidly asked to visit. Do-yeon responded with a cold, empty look. His short and dry "understood" struck Nikki like an electric shock. While the brunette looked straight ahead impassively, the blonde mentally shouted in outrage. He firmly decided never to associate with this cheeky newcomer. Outside the school windows, the autumn leaves were crimson. After this incident, time simply went on as usual. The blonde happily pulled him by the hand, promising to introduce him to her friends. By the school lockers, she briskly introduced him to two girls. He politely smiled at the new acquaintances. Packing his backpack after classes, he caught himself thinking that the school turned out to be not so special at all. Clicking the clasp, the boy disappointedly admitted, he already knows all these basic things, so he doesn't understand why they need to be taught. Suddenly, a blonde girl jumped up to the desk and called him home. This sincere interest from peers was something unusual for him. He silently looked up at her. The boy had no idea how to accept such friendliness, while the girl cheerfully chirped about Nikki, who lives nearby and walks. Autumn leaves swirled in the air, as she added that her father always sees her off, but Nikki usually takes the bus. On the way, Do-yeon confirmed that his mother would pick him up, to which Nikki grumbled discontentedly that he did not want to go with him at all. Seeing his mother near the black car, Do-yeon stopped to say goodbye. The new acquaintances waved at him warmly as he left. He smiled slightly and waved back. Nikki loves swimming so much, carelessly echoed in his memory. He caught himself thinking that he should invite him over. The boy suddenly froze like he was rooted to the spot in the middle of the street. What was he just thinking about? Touched by these kind and gentle looks, his face was distorted by horror, and cold sweat rolled down his forehead. How dare he succumb to this foreign warmth, forgetting about his brother who died in utter hatred and contempt. And all this just because he was born with an inferior soul. The boy pressed his trembling hand to his face. What was that past life anyway? Meanwhile, the bright sun flooded the facade of the modern mansion. In the dim corridor, a woman quietly knocked on the door. She froze in anxious silence. Before her eyes again stood his gloomy appearance in the car. Although she just wanted to ask about school, the woman lowered her head for a moment, warding off weakness. No, she firmly decided to move on without regret, and confidently pressed the door handle. A quiet "Do-yeon" sounded. The boy sat in semi-darkness, clutching the massive case, until his knuckles turned white. The woman froze on the threshold. They were separated by about 10 steps, but now it seemed as if the child had fenced himself off from her with an insurmountable abyss. Her fingers nervously dug into her own shoulder. She wanted to call him once more, but faltered. Yet she called out at full voice, and the boy flinched from surprise. A dull anxiety was reflected on her face. Dokyeon peeked out fearfully from behind the case. He did not even notice how she entered. The woman stepped closer. The boy knew that his strange condition would be exposed, but desperately delayed this moment. He was terribly afraid that his memories of his brother would be called an illness, and he would be forcibly treated. She stopped in front of him and quietly asked what had happened. Her eyes filled with pain. The woman nervously clenched the collar of the sweater. She exhaled with relief and smiled faintly. The boy was leaning against the wall with a massive case in his hands when his mother asked if he was tired of sitting in the room. At the suggestion to take a walk, his eyes widened in surprise. The woman pretended not to notice anything and gently suggested going to the sea. The boy refused and chose a regular walk around the neighborhood. The mother let him go alone, instructing him to avoid strangers and dark alleys. Familiar requests to call the police at the slightest suspicion flew after him. Stepping outside, he decided to walk just enough so she wouldn't start worrying. However, his hospital pass took its toll. The boy quickly got tired and out of breath. Ahead, a wooden gazebo was visible, where he decided to rest a little. He slowly approached closer. On the ground near someone's sneakers lay an unknown sheet of paper. The boy picked it up and read it carefully. He gripped the pages with a death grip. His eyes instantly widened in shock. In front of him was a real script, densely handwritten. A loud sound made the boy with the guitar on his back jerk sharply and curse in fright. Turning around, he noticed an unknown man on a bench in the gazebo. The man relaxedly propped his head and, holding the same manuscript, wondered with interest, could this young man be the true owner of the text? The man sat on a park bench and nervously scribbled something on the paper. Sweat rolled down his face, and his gaze was extremely tense. Crack! And the pen's refill broke from the intense pressure. He grabbed his head and screamed desperately. The man painfully clenched his hair. No matter how many times he rewrote the text, it was all in vain. He was already scolding himself for so confidently quitting his job for the sake of shooting an independent film. Exhaustedly sighing, he helplessly leaned back on the bench. Suddenly, his gaze caught on something. He got up confused, not understanding when his papers had managed to scatter. Right at his feet stood a small boy with a huge white case on his back. The man froze in surprise. The boy looked at him with big blue eyes. With such a bright appearance, the camera would definitely love him. Then the man realized. The kid was firmly holding his lost script in his hands. The man sat on the bench and uncertainly called out to the boy with the guitar case, who was holding his most secret script. Suddenly he stopped. He swallowed nervously. The boy was intently flipping through the pages, while the author mentally doubted whether the child would be interested in such a text at all. The sheets rustled quietly against the backdrop of a clear sky. Finally, the word, "The End," appeared. The boy abruptly raised his eyes, and the man could not bear the tension, asking about his impressions. He stood up and confidently crossed his arms over his chest, demanding feedback as payment for reading without permission. The boy politely apologized, but the author just waved it off, waiting for the verdict. Deep down, he nurtured the hope that the boy at least managed to understand the plot. "Not interesting," the boy said coldly. The writer froze. Trying to save the situation, he began nervously stammering that the child simply did not understand the essence, while the boy guiltily realized his excessive straightforwardness. At that very moment, the man's self-esteem shattered into pieces with a crash. The blond man indignantly spread his hands, demanding an explanation of what was so boring in his text, to which the boy with the massive case calmly replied, "The plot is too peaceful." The screenwriter abruptly jabbed the manuscript right in the child's face. He passionately argued that this was a deep scene of sacrifice and reconciliation. But the boy only skeptically asked if this part was really supposed to be touching. The man angrily called him a heartless little boy, but the boy coldly retorted that his sensitivity was perfectly fine. The boy frowned displeased and added, the ending seemed mediocre to him because he did not understand the logic of the hero's actions. The man smiled smugly, certain that the child simply did not notice the hints scattered throughout the text. The boy calmly asked if it was about the 50-second scene, to which the screenwriter condescendingly grimaced and advised not to lie. And suddenly he froze when it dawned on him. The boy remembered all the details after reading the manuscript only once. The man feverishly clutched his papers. 16th, 41st, 52nd. The pages quickly flickered in his hands. The boy raised a serious look and asked if it was true that the character Yu clung to life more desperately than others. He clearly laid out the motivation. For Yu, a person named Isaiah, was a new chance, So self-sacrifice to protect him became a true reconciliation with himself for the hero, not just a banal escape. Suddenly the boy blushed deeply and angrily exclaimed that such philosophy was obviously just too complicated for a child's understanding. The argument in the park flared up instantly. The boy called the man a naive idealist, and the man retorted by barking at the pessimistic little brat. The air between them crackled with tension. They locked fierce gazes, throwing sparks straight into each other's eyes. The boy snorted contemptuously and sharply turned away. A moment of silence. The boy walked away, wishing the uncle to do whatever he pleased, to which he received an irritated "good riddance" in response. As soon as the child left, the man's fire instantly died out. Cold sweat appeared on his face from the realization of his own foolishness. 34 years old, and he was seriously quarreling with a child because of his fiery temper. A blurred golden memory flashed before his eyes for a second. Meanwhile, the boy stopped uncertainly and looked back over his shoulder. Standing in the middle of the empty alley, he still admitted that he had said too much and fully deserved the anger. A heavy sigh. He walked alone in the rays of the setting sun, bitterly regretting that he never apologized. An ordinary sunny day over the school building. In the spacious dining hall, as always, there was noise. Dokyeon silently picked at his lunch, completely immersed in his own thoughts. The blonde boy opposite glanced at him irritably, mentally resenting this feigned coolness. Suddenly a friend appeared nearby and directly asked what he was so lost in thought about. Dokyeon weakly apologized for his detached appearance, but the girl already sensed something was wrong. She cheerfully declared that she was ready to listen to him attentively. After a short pause, the boy admitted he had quarreled with an adult, wanted to apologize, but had no idea how. The friend guessed it was about his mother, but Dokyeon denied it. It was a man he met for the first time in his life only yesterday. The blonde opposite was visibly shaken by these words. He mentally shouted that the newcomer definitely had a bad character. Awkwardly lowering his gaze, Dokyeon told how their conversation became too tense due to minor disagreements. The stranger began openly ignoring him because of his young age, and the boy couldn't stand it and snapped. He tightly squinted from shame, sincerely regretting his rudeness from yesterday. The blonde sharply jumped up from the table in the dining room, exclaiming that all this was terribly annoying. The dark-haired boy calmly agreed. He also hated when they were belittled and considered fools just because of their age. Suddenly her palms tightly squeezed his hand. Leaning in close, the girl passionately ordered not to apologize first under any circumstances. She grinned triumphantly and confidently. Caught off guard, he could only nod confusedly. Their friend, meanwhile, froze over his portion of food, staring in complete stupor at the intertwined hands. Are they idiots? The silent question hung over the bright schoolyard. Sunlight reflections. Later, in the art lesson, the teacher joyfully announced a free topic, allowing to draw anything. The boy froze over the empty album. Words about "what you like" spun in his head, and his pencil decisively touched the paper. In the sunlit classroom, he sat alone at the desk, completely absorbed in his drawing. With a quiet step in the soft glow, a boy appeared, calmly looking with his blue eyes. The boy quietly sat at the school desk, leaning over the sheet. The pencil rhythmically slid over the paper. He was simply drawing what he loved. The classroom door opened, and the teacher from the doorway commanded everyone to sit and draw. But the students crowded around one desk, calling her to look at Dokyeon's work in turn. Intrigued, the woman moved between the rows. She approached the boy from behind. Her eyes widened in surprise. The teacher covered her mouth with her palm, barely audibly gasping. From the ordinary pencil sketch, a young man was smiling, and the portrait seemed to radiate living warmth. Every stroke convincingly testified to how much Do-hyun loves this person. Feeling this wave of tenderness and longing, the woman could not resist and asked whom he had drawn. The boy shuddered and turned around in surprise. The students and the teacher closely surrounded Do-hyun's desk, praising his talent in turn. The boy looked up in surprise, only now noticing the crowd. The teacher gently calmed the children to give him a chance to answer. She looked closely at the sketch and inquired exactly whom he had drawn. On the paper was a pencil portrait of a young man with an unusually happy smile. Do-hyun quietly replied that this was his brother, Chong Hee-sun. He lowered his eyes to the drawing. To the question about family ties, the boy shook his head in denial. The teacher blinked in surprise. A quiet murmur was heard. She assumed that this was just a very close older friend, and Do-hyun immediately lit up, confirming the guess. His face blossomed with sincere joy when he called him his favorite brother. All present froze in confusion. And the teacher suddenly realized. Little Do-yeon incredibly resembled the man from his own drawing. The autumn day was fading over the school building. The last rays of the sun flooded the windows of the modern house. In his room, the boy sat alone at the table. The boy repeatedly stroked the pencil drawing of a smiling young man, but the paper could not fill the hole in his soul. He bent over in half, crunching his shirt on his chest from longing for his brother. "Why am I still alive?" he gasped in a fit of despair. The young man weakly fell face down on the table, mentally begging for death, when suddenly a bright flash cut through the room. In the silence, a strange voice sounded. Someone calmly asked again, "Better something." He jumped up in fear on the chair. The dazzling light struck his eyes. An unknown coordinator directly asked if he had thought about dying. The voice mercilessly cut with the truth. John Hysun sacrificed his own soul for him, and he doesn't even try to live on. A cluster of light hung just above the carpet, demanding an answer. The entity harshly called him a stupid and selfish human who dared to be angry at John Hysun. The boy froze, turning pale with horror. Cold white light covered his eyes. The boy lowered his head into the void. Could he really have been so wrong? He sat motionless in front of the window, realizing the bitter truth. His brother had deceived him and left him here alone. "I never wanted this," he burst out, painfully clenching the tabletop. Before his eyes flashed the hospital ward. Back then, still a child, he sincerely wanted to die together with his brother, not to live on, feeding on his soul. He dreamed of disappearing forever with happy memories, but his brother turned out to be a liar, single-handedly placing the burden of their promise on him. Strength finally left the boy, and he helplessly slumped in the chair. Suddenly, a bright ray flashed behind the glass, and the word coordinator echoed in his mind. He convulsively grabbed his shirt at the chest, choking on tears and despair. The semi-dark room silently swallowed his quiet sobbing. The darkness was suddenly torn apart by a sunny memory. A school classroom, and a classmate who asked in surprise why he was not drawing today. The girl enthusiastically praised his works, reminding him of their teacher's pride. But the boy only shook his head with regret, refusing to pick up the pencil. The boy lowered his gaze, quietly admitting that drawing no longer interested him. The girl abruptly grabbed his hands, not believing that he was ready to just give up his talent. He remained silent, bitterly realizing he had no photos left with his brother. Perhaps it was worth preserving memories on paper and filling the sketchbook with their shared moments, even if it was just a futile attempt to soothe the longing. Hearing that he would still draw, the girl lit up. His work from yesterday seemed so warm to her that it made her happier. The boy nervously fidgeted with his fingers. Then she suddenly reminded him of yesterday's quarrel, which he had completely forgotten. The girl pressed him with questions, so he had to promise to apologize today. He admitted that he had also behaved rudely, and she gently supported his decision to reconcile. He looked at her intently. Earlier, the boy considered her simply kind, but now he increasingly understood how unusual she was. Recalling her sociability and considerable popularity in the class, he could not comprehend why such a girl would want to be friends with him at all. The boy cast a gloomy glance at his reflection and sharply turned away. With bitterness, he thought that he was miserable and completely unremarkable. The autumn wind quietly rustled in the golden leaves of the park. The boy with the backpack silently walked along the park path. The blonde sat on the bench with a notebook, mentally noting the boy's next appearance. Suddenly he tensed and shuddered. The boy with the case on his back silently appeared right in front of him. They froze, facing each other. A heavy silence hung. The boy looked completely calm, while the adult turned blue with discomfort. Finally, the boy awkwardly coughed and admitted that he had come to apologize. The young man apologized for his past rudeness, causing the man to blink in confusion. The blonde was instantly overwhelmed with shame. An adult man had snapped at a child, and now the child was the one apologizing first. The boy sincerely repeated his apologies. The man awkwardly looked away and began clumsily choosing words in response. His sweaty hand rested on the written sheets. The blonde man smiled crookedly and hesitantly extended his corrections. He nervously clenched his pants at the knee and asked to read the text once more. The boy with the backpack froze, blinking in surprise with wide eyes. The final logo of the manhwa appeared on the screen. The exhausted man extended the written sheets and admitted that he had slightly corrected the text. He carefully asked to read the manuscript once more. The young boy with a guitar case on his back silently looked at him. The script passed from hand to hand. While the boy was reading, the writer froze on the bench, clenching his palms in anticipation of the verdict. After the previous devastating criticism, he did not close his eyes and fiercely rewrote every page to prove his point. Unable to endure the long pause, the man asked not to sugarcoat and to tell it like it is. He smiled nervously, covered in sweat, and repeatedly inquired whether it really turned out interesting. Suddenly he noticed how the boy's face changed, and everything inside him grew cold. The boy coldly cut off that it was uninteresting, and the man recoiled in shock. He muttered crushed that he put his whole soul into these lines and could not understand his mistake. But the boy unexpectedly praised the text itself. The composition became better, and all the boring moments disappeared. The essence lay in the story of the tender young gentleman Isai and his antipode, the street thief Yu, on the contrast of whom the entire plot was built. Yu gloomily hid his face under the hood. He hated Isaiah with all his soul, who responded to him only with sincere kindness. To break the boy, Yu mercilessly lied and dragged him down to the bottom. But eventually he himself opened his heart to him. They walked together through the sunlit field, holding hands tightly. Yu sacrificed his life to save Isaiah, and met death with a joyful smile on his bloodied face. The boy tore his gaze away from the pages, realizing that the flaw was not in the script at all, but in himself. An adult man on the bench sharply interrupted the child's thoughts. He grimaced irritably and directly advised to find another reader. The young man was afraid that the manuscript would be returned unread, but the mentor admitted he simply could not empathize with Yu's emotions. The boy immediately began to justify himself, admitting it was his personal weakness. Then the man decisively took the script and declared that his main task was to help the boy understand these feelings. A brief silence. A warm, encouraging smile appeared on his face. A happy family in the cinema. A warm picture from the past that gave birth to the dream of creating stories understandable to everyone. Fingers clenched a handwritten sheet with the question of when he would come again. The boy stopped by the bench and grumbled that he had already said to look for someone else. The blond man looked straight and resolutely. He was going to convince this very boy. The little one blinked confusedly. A heavy sigh, and he reluctantly agreed. Bright sun flooded the green crowns of the trees. In the park gazebo, the man snapped. He waved his hands irritably, not understanding the interlocutor's reaction. The boy snapped back, sharply demanding to stop the questioning about his sensitivity. The man slammed the rewritten pages of the script on the table, and this time, the little one nodded approvingly. They burned each other with their glances until sparks flew in the air. The man wearily leaned back on the bench, muttering about the child's fussiness, while the child calmly flipped through the text. Suddenly he stared at the sheets and thoughtfully said, "In this scene, the hero should think quite differently." The man saw only sympathy or pity in this. However, the child objected. His hero would also feel superiority. Yes, superiority, he repeated firmly. The blond man thoughtfully rubbed his chin, beginning to understand the idea. Only for this, it would be necessary to completely reshape the character of the protagonist. 3 weeks passed since their reconciliation. In constant disputes, the cheeky boy quickly grew into an equal co-author. Working to exhaustion, they rewrote the entire script from scratch 6 times. The adult was not afraid of revisions, but doubted whether the story would become any better. The boy silently looked at him. Could he really give up and leave the old version? Instead, the man felt a real thrill, much stronger than the usual reading of other people's books. It was pure delight from creating his own world. Isaiah studied the written-off sheets intently, firmly determined to give his all. His gaze greedily ran over the lines. A blond man's voice opposite pulled him out of his thoughts. The boy turned around joyfully. Suddenly, the man glanced aside. Isaiah greeted the Holy Father cheerfully. In the courtyard bathed in morning sunlight, a familiar priest appeared. The boy rushed to meet him with open arms, passing by the blond man. The man was stunned and froze. The priest stopped and greeted the boy with a warm smile. Isaiah immediately started chattering about his new friend, to whom he now brings his favorite cookies every day. He awkwardly waved his hands, assuring that there are still too many sweets left at home anyway. Then he sadly lowered his eyes and quietly added, "His friend has no parents at all. After all, the Holy Father himself always taught that sincere love for the needy neighbor is the most important thing in the world. Yu confessed that someone else's joy brings him true happiness. He pressed his palms to his chest, ready to give his emotions without reserve. With a gentle smile, the young man added that for him, it is not difficult at all. A shadow slid over his clothes. The man opposite sat as if struck by lightning, completely losing the gift of speech. One could go mad, flashed through his mind as sweat rolled down his cheek. The blonde suddenly realized. The barely raised corners of the boy's lips were not modesty, but pure pleasure from his own game. The young man seemed to have 1,000 faces, and instantly reshaped the atmosphere with the slightest movement of his facial expression. And what shocked the most was that he didn't even try to show any extreme emotions. What will happen if he is pushed to the limit, and this is recorded on camera? What if the screen debut of this genius happens in his very first film? Endless rows of the cinema instantly appeared before his eyes. The man's heart beat faster, and his eyes flashed greedily. This chance will change his life forever. From a feverish trance, he was abruptly pulled out by Yu's voice, who was confusedly trying to attract attention. The man pushed aside the written sheets and looked expectantly at the young man. He finally remembered politeness and gave his name. Lee Do-yeon. The man introduced himself as Liam Hope, and immediately asked about the massive white case that the boy never parted with. The answer about the violin made Liam stare in confusion. Liam did not stop. If such a talent does not play, it will be a loss not only for the conservatory, but for all humanity. But the boy curtly cut off, saying he does not like to play. Then why drag her along? Do-yeon smiled warmly. This is an expensive gift that he just wants to keep close. Liam was struck, as if by lightning. In his head, a chain instantly clicked. The character this boy plays, and the violin. Overwhelmed by an explosive wave of inspiration, he grabbed a pen and frantically started writing a new text. Do-yeon tried to address him, but the screenwriter was already deeply immersed in his creative trance. Realizing that dialogue was impossible now, the young man slung the case over his shoulder and decided to come back another time. He was already leaving when suddenly a sharp call from behind made him flinch. The blond man sharply slammed his hand on the table, covered with scripts, and shouted that he would wait here at the same time. Exactly 1 week from now, at this same place. His eyes burned fanatically, and his face flushed with emotion as he barked to definitely come. The boy just froze confusedly, while he was unequivocally ordered to appear like a bayonet. Looking at the clear sky, he mentally assumed that the man had simply lost his mind from constant writing. An ordinary sunny day in the schoolyard. While other children were excitedly running on the grass, the dark-haired boy was just standing still. His thoughts were somewhere far away. In his memory, the shout of a man harshly ordering him to definitely appear at the meeting surfaced. The boy noticeably became nervous from these memories. A football that slowly rolled right to his feet snapped him out of his thoughts. His friend joyfully waved her hands, asking for a pass. He instantly focused. His brain immediately calculated the distance. Exactly 20 meters to Jackie. Taking into account air resistance and gravity, he swung for a perfectly accurate shot. But suddenly, a shadow jumped out from the side. The pink-haired boy brazenly intercepted the ball, mocking its slowness. A powerful dash, and the opponent himself slammed it straight into the goal net. The dark-haired boy froze in shock while Jackie laughed and calmed him down, promising to make a comeback next time. The ball whistled into the net amid shouts about Nicholas's goal, and the dark-haired boy was barely standing on his feet. Nicholas calmly scored another one. The team joyfully celebrated the victory, completely unaware of how their exhausted comrade behind simply bent over in half. He collapsed helplessly onto the grass. Looking at the sky, the boy clearly realized book knowledge alone is not enough. The body sharply lacks endurance. The next morning, the sun shone brightly. Outside the windows of the spacious country house, it was quiet. The boy briskly buttoned up the collar of his sports jacket. His mother asked in surprise where he was going, and Do-yeon replied that it was to the walking path nearby. Mother almost cried with emotion. Her son, who previously never tore himself away from books, decided to go to training by himself. She anxiously ordered him not to overexert himself, and to go home immediately if he got tired, to which he calmly nodded. The boy ran out into the street and began his first jog. Stopping by a wooden signpost, he decided to take a new path today. The boy walked slowly along the empty path, deeply immersed in his own thoughts. Only quiet footsteps were heard. The soles of the sneakers evenly beat a rhythm on the sidewalk. Suddenly, an endless sunlit beach spread out before him. The sound of the surf hit his ears. The boy exhaled with admiration, unable to take his eyes off the shining water. He stepped onto the sand and froze before the waves. Looking around, the boy sadly caught himself thinking that he was seeing the sea for the first time. How he wished to be here, together with his brother. A barely noticeable smile flashed across his face. Suddenly, behind a large rock amid the waves, he noticed something strange. A step directly into the water. Ignoring the wet clothes, he resolutely moved forward, keeping his eyes on the mysterious goal. The water reached his chest, but he stubbornly pushed through the current, convincing himself that there was only a little left. The dark-haired man tensed. Just a little more, and he would reach the goal. Suddenly, he was sharply pulled by the shoulder. Someone with a loud splash jumped into the water right behind him. He turned around and, stunned, recognized Nicholas. "Why are you going into the sea?" he shouted in panic. No word was heard in response, so Nicholas began shaking him hard by the shoulders, demanding an answer and suspecting the worst. From such shaking, the dark-haired man turned pale and barely stood on his feet from dizziness. When Nicholas calmed down a bit, the boy calmly explained that he just wanted to check something. He nodded and pointed forward with his hand. He was interested in a massive stone amid the waves, and Nicholas finally saw it too. A sea lion was lying on it, which for some reason had strayed from the pack and swam here, all alone. The dark-haired one suggested approaching the stone closer and walked forward. Nicholas sighed discontentedly, struggling to move his legs through the strong waves. But since he was already soaked to the skin anyway, there was nothing to lose. The dark-haired one stood waist-deep in the water, intently watching his friend. Suddenly, Nicholas flew backward into the wave with a loud splash. The boy blinked in amazement. He mentally admitted that Nicholas was skilled at everything, while Nicholas was already impatiently calling him to the shore. The water crashed against the rocks with a roar. Having climbed onto the rocks, the dark-haired one confessed that he couldn't swim at all, and his friend sarcastically recalled his failures in physical education. Suddenly, Nicholas sharply turned around, shifting his attention to their mysterious find. Squatting down, Nicholas asked the sea lion why it was sitting here all alone. A muffled slap was heard from the side. A wet flipper slapped against the stone. The dark-haired boy was shockingly clutching the bizarre, plump creature in his hands. The little animal gently rubbed against him, so the boy jokingly suggested that it had mistaken Nicholas for its mother. Puzzled by such a comparison, Nicholas began to drive the little one back into the sea, assuring that its real parents were definitely waiting for it. The dark-haired boy stroked the sea lion and quietly asked if it remembered the way home. The animal dived into the waves with a loud splash. The boys silently watched it with their eyes. The dark-haired boy exhaled with relief. It was good that the beast was returning on its own, and he wouldn't have to accompany it. Nearby on the shore, Nicholas was uncontrollably shivering from the cold, soaked to the bone. The dark-haired man threw his damp jacket over his shoulders, ignoring with a slight smile the grumbling about both of them being cold. He silently turned around and walked away, leaving wet footprints on the sand. He suddenly called Nicholas by name, making the boy sharply turn around. In the bright rays of the sun, he sincerely thanked for the help. Nicholas awkwardly waved it off, reminding that the lion had returned to the family on its own anyway. But the dark-haired man shook his head. He was thankful that Nicholas had worried, and without hesitation, rushed to save him from the water. They froze, facing each other. Nicholas's face flushed, his eyes widened, and he blurted out confusedly that then he should continue to be grateful. And, sharply turning on his heels, he quickly walked away. The pinkish man froze in confusion, recalling the frightened look of the little one. "God, Do-hyun, what happened?" the woman shouted, finding the boy in a cold sweat. The girl rushed into the classroom, greeting joyfully, while Do-hyun nervously sweated behind the desk. He kept glancing down the corridor. His girlfriend noticed his depressed state, and the boy admitted that he was worried about Nicholas's absence. "Ah, that fool?" she grimaced sharply. Do-hyun blinked in surprise. The girl irritably blurted out that Nikki had caught a cold. Yesterday, he secretly ran away from home, and for some reason went swimming in the icy sea. She suddenly stopped. Do-hyun lowered his gaze and quietly said that Nicholas ended up in the water only because of him. The girlfriend rolled her eyes. Do-hyun quickly and honestly recounted the whole mishap from yesterday to her. The girl wearily rubbed her temple, sympathizing with Nikki, who had already been scolded by his mother, and then began to reprimand her interlocutor. She scolded him for recklessness and inability to swim, making the boy shamefully shrink into the chair. He finally hung his head under the weight of his own guilt. After class, Lee Do-yoon suddenly suggested visiting Nikki. The girl gladly agreed, remembering that his older sister Narsha should be at home right now. The door was opened by Narsha herself, who joyfully greeted the guest from the threshold. After warm hugs, the hostess inquired whom her friend had brought. She leaned with interest toward the unfamiliar boy. He hesitated slightly, but immediately stepped forward and greeted. The boy calmly introduced himself as Lee Do-yoon and explained that he had come to see Nicholas. Narsha suddenly froze and blushed faintly. She was mentally struck by the fact that her brother had such a sweet and calm companion. The girl's surprised question brought Narsha out of her stupor, and she hastily invited the children inside to warmth. The guests entered the house, learning that Nicholas was currently sleeping in his room. Do-yoon took off his backpack and anxiously asked if everything was so bad with his friend. Narsha wearily rubbed her temple. At night, her brother had a high fever after he thought to go into the sea in such terrible weather. Hearing the threat to harshly deal with the sick one after recovery, the dark-haired boy nervously flinched. The little one timidly spoke up, and Narsha asked in surprise what had happened. Narsha was genuinely surprised. The little one suddenly admitted that Nicholas had rushed into the sea because of him. Lowering his gaze, he explained guiltily that his friend was simply scared and wanted to save him. The boy bowed low, asking for forgiveness, but Narsha immediately asked what he himself had forgotten in the water. The little one admitted that he noticed something strange on the opposite cliff. He wanted to examine the find more closely, and did not realize how he went too deep. Narsha only smiled warmly. Recalling all of Nikki's past pranks, she was convinced that he simply could not have calm friends, and with interest asked about the cliff. He explained that it was a sea lion pup. While the boy continued to awkwardly defend his friend, the woman mentally melted at this killer cute children's company. The little one hesitated uncertainly, and then he raised big, hopeful eyes to her and quietly asked not to scold Nicholas. It was a blow right to the heart. Narsha barely stood on her feet, instantly disarmed by such incredible cuteness. Jin chirped happily, leading Do-hyun to Nicholas's room. The door opened slightly at her worried exclamation. Sick Nikki sat in bed and weakly coughed, grumbling displeased at the noise. Hearing that Do-hyun had come, he widened his eyes. The boy shuddered from surprise. He indignantly poked the guest with his finger, demanding an explanation for why he had barged in. Yesterday, and Do-hyun's mocking laugh instantly surfaced in memory. Nikki flared up with offense at such contempt, completely ignoring Jin's attempts to calm him down. Then Do-hyun awkwardly lowered his gaze, calling it all a senseless misunderstanding. He looked Nikki straight in the eyes and firmly stated that he was not laughing at him. On the contrary, he was very cool. Nikki was stunned. Do-hyun sincerely added that yesterday's swimming in the sea looked impressive. The sick boy blushed deeply and frowningly pulled the blanket over his chest. Feigning a cough, he graciously forgave the guest, and Do-hyun only smiled warmly in response. Nikki coughed hoarsely in bed while the friends were saying goodbye. The boy wished him a speedy recovery, and the girl added that being sick was not his style at all. Nikki's mother suggested they stay for dinner with the parents, and at the same time introduce them to the new friend. She smiled kindly and suggested postponing the joint dinner so as not to leave the sick boy alone. Nikki's mother gladly agreed to postpone the gathering and immediately offered to drive the guests home. Outside the window, the clear blue sky was shining. A white car smoothly drove along the sunlit street, and the woman thanked the children once again for the visit. They calmly settled in the back seat. At the wheel, Nikki's mother warmly asked them to definitely come again and to cherish the friendship with her son. The dark-haired boy became thoughtful, suddenly realizing all this kindness and care around are based solely on boundless love for Nicholas. His gaze froze. Before his eyes, his own mother instantly appeared, always sincere and smiling despite the exhausting work at the company. She firmly refused to have a housekeeper and always lovingly packed his bento herself. No matter how hard it was, she came every morning to wake him up, and from school she always met him with open arms. The woman's voice sharply pulled him out of his memories. The car stopped. They had arrived. Do-hyun was about to get out of the car, thanking for the ride. Suddenly, someone's hand gently caught his sleeve. The blonde leaned closer and quietly called him by name. She stealthily glanced at the boy and confessed that she had known everything from the beginning. "You and Nikki don't get along very well," she whispered into his ear. Do-hyun froze in confusion, while the girl hurriedly explained that she was simply afraid of misunderstandings between them. With a warm smile, she assured him, "Nicky never picks on those he truly hates, and behind his prickly pride hides a simple desire to be friends." The car drove away, leaving Do-kyun on the sidewalk with her last hope that the two friends dear to her would finally understand each other. The words about a dear friend echoed in his head as his fingers nervously clenched the collar of his jacket. Suddenly, his memory brought up the hospital room where his older brother asked little Do-kyun not just to exist, but to live happily with all his might. Walking down the empty street, the boy could not understand why this testament surfaced in his memory right now. The memory slowly faded away. Instead of moving on, he heavily sat down on a lonely park bench. For some reason, he did not want to go home immediately, and he thoughtfully looked ahead. The vibration made him jerk sharply. The phone screen brightly flashed a message from Liam Hope. "The script is ready." Fingers froze above the screen. The young man sat calmly on the bench until suddenly the phone's vibration made him flinch. A message from Liam Hope lit up the screen. "The script is ready." Sunlight glare, clear blue sky. The meeting place was a quiet park gazebo. The boy abruptly stood up, noticing a familiar figure in a green hoodie. He greeted hesitantly, but Liam only grinned maniacally. With creepy circles under his eyes, he tightly gripped the manuscript and declared he had been waiting for this day for a long time. As soon as they sat at the table, the blonde nervously slid him the papers. The young man barely swallowed the question about what had happened to him during that time. Deciding to first evaluate the work, he opened the first page. Liam leaned over him, literally snorting with impatience. Silence. Only the wind rustled the bare branches. The boy's eyes widened. What he read instantly and completely absorbed his attention. Suddenly, a palm slapped the pages onto the table with a loud smack. The boy ran his eyes over the sheet and calmly admitted that the script was interesting. Liam's cheeks instantly flushed. He laughed loudly, boastfully declaring that his creation could not be bad. The man leaned back on the bench, laughing contentedly. The boy silently waited for him to calm down. Suddenly, Liam sharply leaned forward and pressed the manuscript to the table. His face became serious as he quietly thanked him. In response to the silent surprise, he explained, "Without the boy, this text simply would not exist." And then he declared that he intended to credit him as a co-author. The young man stared at the papers in shock, but Liam was absolutely confident in his decision. The boy lowered his head, and his heart began to beat wildly. A script with his own name. He objected uncertainly, as he was only sharing his impressions of what he had read. However, the man reminded him of their long discussions and forbade even thinking about refusal. Liam smiled warmly, brushing off the thanks. Suddenly he fell silent, looking intently at his interlocutor. He was struck that this gloomy boy, who always seemed like a little old man, could actually make such an innocent, childish face. They sat together at a wooden table in a sunlit park. A brief pause hung in the air. Lowering his gaze to the finished manuscript, Liam quietly said that now their meetings were over. The boy turned sharply, asking anxiously if he would never come here again. At these words, Liam's eyes widened in surprise, but he immediately broke into a sly smile and admitted that he had hidden the most important thing. Ahead was a pile of work on the future film, but the boy sincerely assured that Liam would definitely cope. The man swallowed nervously. Grasping this thought, he steered the conversation to the main point. Pressing his hand to his chest, Liam smiled warmly and directly offered the boy to act in his film. He froze with eyes wide from shock, barely managing to utter a short, "Huh?" In the sunlit gazebo, the man suddenly offered the boy a role in his film. An ordinary sunny morning near the school. Do-yeon was so immersed in reading that he did not listen to the lesson at all. The boy froze over the desk. The teacher slowly moved between the rows. The teacher's footsteps were already approaching his row, and he still did not take his eyes off the book. The neighbor anxiously whispered his name, and Do-yeon sharply raised his head. The woman stood right in front of him, demanding an answer to the third question. He instantly gave the correct term, explaining that he had already studied it before. The teacher appreciated the preparation, but gently advised to focus on the lesson. Do-yeon quietly apologized and sighed with relief, sitting down in his seat. The recent words of the director about the script resurfaced in his memory. The man looked closely and assured, "This story will only be truly complete if Do-yeon plays the main role in it." The man opposite calmly explained that he himself was filming a movie for the first time, so they were both starting from scratch. He looked intently at the boy and unequivocally stated that he simply had to act. The director passionately praised his innate talent and charisma, until suddenly A loud shout interrupted the speech. The boy suddenly flinched. He was sitting in the school cafeteria, frozen with a spoon over his unfinished lunch. A couple of classmates were staring at him intently. The blonde friend inquired why he was so dazed, since the rest of the children had already eaten and scattered long ago. The boy was surprised. It turned out that the friends had been patiently waiting all this time, not touching their food. The companion smiled warmly and finally suggested getting to the appetizing chicken nuggets. Later, he was already sitting alone in a quiet room, monotonously moving the brush over the easel. The paint lay on the paper in quick strokes. The boy stopped and gloomily examined the result. Instead of a drawing, there was only a dirty gray blotch, which he irritably called nonsense. Sighing heavily, he propped his head with his hand. From that very day, everything went awry, and he bitterly regretted not refusing immediately then. The blonde smiled slyly, reminding the boy that he himself loved to play. In response, only a heavy sigh was heard. The man's phone suddenly vibrated from a new message. A short request for a meeting appeared on the screen. The cafe veranda was bathed in sunlight. 2 cups of coffee steamed on the table. Sitting opposite the director, the young man calmly broke the silence and agreed to the role. The blonde man's face instantly lit up with childlike delight. He joyfully showered the youth with compliments, but the latter cold-bloodedly interrupted him. He had a condition. The young man raised a finger and clearly voiced the demand. He wanted to play you. The man burst into a ringing laugh, immediately agreeing. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and he froze with a face pale from shock. While the youth happily imagined himself in the dreamed-of role, the director muttered confusedly that he had actually already assigned him the role of Isaiah. A tense pause hung over the table. At the table over the cup of coffee, the blonde tensed to sparks around and declared unequivocally that he wanted to play you. In response, a panicked scream sounded that this was a huge problem. At the cafe, the blonde man was persuading the boy to take the role of the debauched young master Isaiah, but the young actor insisted he would only play you. The man rubbed his chin in confusion. No matter how you look at it, that angelic face was literally made for Isaiah. When asked about the reason for his choice, the boy calmly replied that he wanted to better understand this character. Realizing that the boy would not give up so easily, the man raised a finger and proposed a bet. He gave him exactly 1 week to show his own vision of you. The condition was simple. If after that the man himself wanted to see him in this role, the kid would win. Otherwise, the boy would play Isaiah, as planned from the very beginning. The man mentally celebrated, realizing that he would come out ahead regardless of the outcome. However, aloud he confidently stated that he did not even consider the possibility of his own defeat. The boy looked at him intently and with a slight challenge asked if he was perhaps doubting his own victory. The blonde merely crossed his arms over his chest, and in the semi-darkness of the cafe, a silent excitement flared between them. The man smiled fiercely, and the tension between him and the boy sparkled in the air. The boy calmly held that gaze and firmly said he accepted the bet. The sunlit roof of the house breathed tranquility. The boy slapped the printed script with a swing of his palm. Having received the final text, he deliberately erased from his memory all previous discussions of the role with Liam. He wanted to perceive the story with an absolutely clear mind. After that, he simply read, greedily devouring page after page, until he reached the moment where he had to engage his imagination. He closed his eyes, carefully constructing the future scene in his mind. The imagination immediately painted a dark alley, littered with cigarette butts, from which a musty smell sharply emanated. The narrow walls were completely covered with dirty graffiti. The silence of the alley was broken by measured footsteps. A gloomy young man in a black hoodie was habitually walking through this dump, with his hands hidden in his pockets. A 10-year-old Asian boy was surviving in dirty slums, getting by on miserable crumbs of food. Smaller than his peers, he tensely kept his hands in his pockets in a defensive stance, perhaps hiding a recently stolen wallet. Suddenly, from around the corner, a greeting to you was heard, and the boy flinched fearfully. To the carefree question about his mood, he sharply turned and hostilely asked who that was. Muttering why this stranger was bothering him, Yu turned around and silently walked away. To the next question about breakfast, he gloomily replied, nothing, surprisingly obediently answering the weirdo. However, the question about the color of his socks was the last straw. Yu burst out shouting, fiercely demanding to be left alone. Like an artist applying layer upon layer of paint in search of the right shade, The creator was shaping this image. He was just finishing his painting titled You. Sitting at the desk, the author began mentally throwing the hero into various life situations. Each time, Yule's choice frighteningly exactly matched his own, and he finally stopped separating himself from the character. The boundary between them blurred, and soon completely lost its meaning. He decisively grabbed the handle and opened the door. The imaginary world finally collapsed, forcibly pulling Do-hyun back into reality. The mother turned around, calling her son to school. Her face suddenly twitched. Worriedly looking at him, she cautiously asked if something had happened recently. Do-hyun coldly cut off, saying everything was fine, and indifferently walked past. Morning near the high school. The usual life was bustling in the classroom. A classmate was lively, retelling something to an acquaintance. Do-hyun sat nearby, but mentally was far away from here. To her question, he responded only with a dull and indifferent As soon as the girl spoke about tiredness, he slammed the desk and shouted irritably that he was listening carefully. The pink-haired boy in front couldn't stand it and directly asked what was wrong with him. Do-hyun frowned in response, but the classmate just indignantly poked him with a finger. "Why are you behaving so arrogantly?" sharply echoed throughout the class. The dark-haired boy gloomily drilled the space with his gaze, barely tolerating the girl's senseless chatter nearby. Another classmate was straining his voice right next to his ear. Rage inside boiled. He was unbearably annoyed by absolutely everyone. He sat motionless, mentally cursing these annoying, stupid people around him. A heavy, depressed sigh. Suddenly, the boy sharply changed his tone and apologized for his behavior, which greatly puzzled his neighbor. A perfect friendly smile instantly lit up his face, but the eyes remained dead when he asked again, in an icy tone, if everything was all right now. Classmates simply froze in silent tension from this eerie mood swing. The high blue sky. Measured footsteps sounded. A serious blonde man in a denim jacket stepped outside. A question hung in the air, whether he had prepared well enough. Meanwhile, the true nature of the dark-haired youth was revealed. Now he was Isaiah in priest's clothing, a completely reimagined character after the Do-hyun game. Liam walked through the yard, mentally doubting that Do-hyun would manage to get into the complex role of Yu at all. Suddenly, a short greeting was heard ahead. The man froze sharply. The boy in the black hoodie turned around, and in the sunlight, his gaze seemed far from childish. Liam confusedly called him by the character's name, to which the boy calmly replied that a whole week had passed since their last meeting. The actor quickly pulled himself together and cleared his throat, promising not to make any concessions due to age, but Do-hyun was not intimidated. He came to win. The man only smiled confidently, having no doubts about the outcome. He unfolded his notes and inquired which exact scene the opponent had prepared. The boy calmly nodded at the sheet in Liam's hands. The adult actor's face stretched in shock. Hearing that the boy had memorized the entire text in a week, Liam instantly challenged him to perform the 33rd scene right now. To the question of whether he could manage, under the clear sky came a firm and short yes. Scene 33. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the path to the cathedral. Yu was going to meet Isaiah. She closed her eyes intently at the hollow command to prepare. The silence was cut by a loud action. The off-screen voice asked about readiness and gave the command to start scene 33. Yu slowly walked along the path to the cathedral to meet Isaiah. After the command motor, he opened his eyes, instantly plunging into an emotional state. The majestic cathedral towered against the backdrop of a cloudless sky. Yu approached Isaiah, who was sitting on a bench, and quietly asked him to hear his confession. He pressed his hand to his chest, recalling yesterday's mass and the parishioners' prayers for him. The air around seemed to sparkle with tension. The boy's face was distorted by horror. He whispered that he did not deserve this kindness at all. Yu convulsively clung to Isaiah's hand, fearing that a true priest would never grant him forgiveness. He asked desperately if his friend would also turn away from him. Isaiah stood stoically silent, hiding his face in the cold shadow. Unable to bear it, Yu weakly lowered his head and covered his eyes with his hand. Crossing himself, he said, "Amen," and confessed his sin to his brother. The boy closed his eyes and painfully exhaled that he had broken the 8th commandment. He clenched the fabric on his chest until his knuckles turned white. He said that his parents are alive and well and have no needs, and that he himself left home long ago. Through the confessional crack, an eye flashed, and a muffled voice confessed to breaking the 4th commandment. In childhood, he was told that parents give the most precious things: life and upbringing, but his own family simply threw him out as a baby onto the cold street. The foster parents turned out to be no better. Tired and empty, he grew up neglected, needed by no one, neither in body nor in soul. The voice in the darkness broke off to tell about the seventh commandment. After running away from home, the boy found himself under an icy downpour, without a roof, clothes, or food. To survive, he began to steal. Only other people's money allowed him to find shelter and buy food. "Can I be forgiven?" he begged the confused priest in despair. And then the third confession sounded, about breaking the 10th commandment. In the darkness, eyes shone predatory. All this time he craved another's, unblinkingly staring at the perfectly clean cuffs and polished shoes of his brother. A dark aura swirled at his feet, under the muffled words about ancient and unquenchable envy towards the brother. The boy looked fearfully at the interlocutor and quietly asked if he himself was the devil. In the light-filled church, the child desperately begged for an answer, whether he could ever receive forgiveness. The priest's face was covered by a black shadow. He bitterly doubted that the Lord would even notice such a nobody. "I am scared," whispered the little one, and tears rolled down his cheeks. Suddenly, a ghostly purple snake coiled around the man's leg. The boy firmly grasped his palm and sharply demanded Isaiah to prove his words. Behind the child, who a second ago was sincerely crying, an aura of a gigantic serpent suddenly grew. The monster opened its jaws predatory. At that very moment, the tears disappeared, and a creepy smile spread across the little one's face. From the very beginning, he had skillfully played on others' sympathy. The bloody red flash of the strike put a cruel full stop in this scene, and the blond man on the bench simply froze with his jaw dropped, stunned by the boy's brilliant acting. The man's face darkened, and a cold drop of sweat rolled down his temple. The boy opposite stood a little puzzled, admitting that he had not even considered the thought of his own defeat. The exhausted man sat heavily on the bench and, raising his hands, openly acknowledged the boy's victory. In the youth's chest, a loud thump echoed from just hearing the word. He believed in his triumph from the very beginning, considering it something ordinary, but his heart pounded wildly, forcing him to tightly clutch the fabric of his sweatshirt on his chest. Suddenly, everything became clear. This was his very first victory, which he had won purely by his own efforts. Meanwhile, the man abruptly jumped up from the bench with a loud laugh and began energetically planning location scouting and castings. He hastily stuffed stacks of papers into his bag, complaining about the huge pile of work. A few white sheets slipped out and swirled in the air. Throwing the bag over his shoulder, the man briskly walked away and shouted at the last moment to call him if needed. But he hadn't gone far when suddenly he let out a frightened scream and sharply looked back. In Do-yeon's ears still echoed the demand to sign the contract and definitely talk to his parents. He was thinking about what to say to his mother as he opened the door of the house. From the threshold, he was greeted by a familiar voice. His mother was standing in the kitchen and happily announced that she had just prepared dinner. The boy calmly replied that he would wash up and come down. The woman blossomed with relief, noticing that her son was in a good mood today. A luxurious homemade meal was already steaming on the table. Wishing him a good meal, the mother carefully sat opposite him. She secretly observed her son and mentally rejoiced. Now he was sitting straight and eating normally, not hunched over the plate like he was this morning. Suddenly Do-yeon raised his eyes and, choosing his words, admitted that he had a request. The woman shuddered with surprise, but at that very moment, she passionately blurted out that she would do absolutely everything for him. Hearing that her son wanted to act in a movie, she beamed with happiness and immediately rushed to promise to buy everything necessary. She blinked in shock, not believing her own ears. To her trembling question, Do-yeon calmly answered over dinner that he wanted to act in a movie. The woman was speechless. One word simply exploded in her head. All the previous strange details instantly came together into a single picture. She recalled how, still in the hospital bed, Do-yeon passionately acted out scenes from books. Hiding such a talent from the world seemed to her a crime, so she immediately began mentally searching for acting schools and auditions for him. The woman joyfully offered to buy professional literature, but suddenly stopped. Do-yeon politely thanked, but stated that he had already been approved for a role in the film. A dead silence hung over the table. Both awkwardly glanced at each other. The silence of the evening neighborhood was shattered by her deafening, shocked scream. The path from child actor to global star had just begun. At dinner, the mother asked in surprise when Do-yeon had managed to go to the audition, but the son calmly stated that he had already received a role in the film. The woman stared at him in astonishment. A barely audible, frightened sound escaped from her lips. Do-kyeon casually asked for permission to film, while the mother mentally wondered how far ahead he had calculated everything. Coming to her senses, she joyfully exclaimed that the boy could do whatever he wished. A light clatter of dishes sounded over the table, and the woman again addressed her son. She cautiously inquired whether he had recently rehearsed his role in real life. Do-kyeon was embarrassed and quietly confirmed her suspicion. He explained that it was much easier to immerse himself in the role that way. The puzzle in her head instantly came together. All his strange behavior turned out to be just acting. Thank God, the mother exhaled and grabbed her heart with great relief, making her son flinch. The boy blinked confusedly, realizing that she had already imagined the worst. Do-kyeon assured that everything was fine, and the mother immediately got down to business and asked for the director's number to arrange a contract. A quiet step on the floor. The boy blinked confusedly, unable to find words. Relief was felt. She was really afraid that something had happened to him. He lowered his head in the semi-darkness, struck by the realization that someone cared about him. The next morning greeted him with a cloudless sky over the school. The classroom door creaked. He awkwardly walked to his desk, throwing a short and dry greeting to the girl next to him. The girl in front only raised her eyebrows in confusion at his dry greeting. Sitting down, he felt a dull wall of alienation. The girl was uncomfortable, and Nicholas simply ignored his presence, his fingers nervously intertwined. In his head, he carefully constructed a dialogue, first to greet, then to ask about his fault and apologize. But his shoulders hunched themselves under the heavy assumption. What if they just hated him? The last month had been strange. No one hated him, and everyone stayed nearby without hesitation. He smiled sincerely, catching himself thinking that he was almost used to all of this. The next second, he was alone again, at the desk in the dark void, trying to convince himself that loneliness is normal and not sad at all. After all, since the very day his brother left, he had been struggling relentlessly in this cold vacuum. From gloomy thoughts, the teacher's voice sharply pulled him out. It was time to divide into groups. The desks were pushed together, but an awkward, lingering silence immediately hung over the trio of students. The blonde girl was the first to give in, and with a nervous smile suggested dividing the instruments. The boys stubbornly stared at their notebooks until he, dripping with sweat, finally squeezed out a reluctant agreement. The girl sighed with relief and joyfully declared that she could take the piano or the guitar. The light-haired neighbor lazily propped his head with his hand and dryly reserved the keyboard instruments. His turn came. A memory flashed before his eyes. The older brother, virtuously playing the violin in a warm glow. He bitterly lowered his head and admitted that the violin was his brother's talent, and he himself could not play anything at all. The girl did not lose composure and gently suggested he take the xylophone or flute. A little practice, and he would definitely manage by the exam. The boy hesitantly agreed to play the recorder, and he and the girl finally moved on to choosing a song. The bell rang. The teacher asked to arrange the desks, announcing the end of the lesson. The class reluctantly stirred. He pushed back the chair and silently stood up under the confused gaze of his classmate. It was a warm, sunny day outside. Only rhythmic footsteps on the cobblestones were heard. The whole trio was walking home together, hidden in a heavy, deaf silence. The dark-haired one nervously glanced over his shoulder. This awkwardness was simply pressing on the brain. The redhead suddenly lost his patience. He stopped and shouted that it annoyed him incredibly. The redhead desperately grabbed his head. It infuriated him incredibly. "What are you doing?" The dark-haired one froze from the sudden shout. The redhead blurted out everything that had been boiling inside. Why the hell had he previously rejected his attempts to talk, and now he himself was trailing behind and constantly staring? The boy couldn't stand it, and blurted out to Do-kyeon right in the face that he was acting like a madman. He even gritted his teeth in anger. Do-kyeon was confused and fell silent. The blonde poked him with a finger and jumped up at the scream, gathering the attention of the whole yard. The boy silently opened his mouth, and someone already shouted at him, "If you have something to say, speak properly." Do-kyeon clasped his fingers. He vainly hoped that silence would save him. He only wanted to continue greeting Jin every morning and silently sharing common meals. His indifference to loneliness turned out to be self-deception. Inside, he was terrified that their communication would end just like that. Barely moving his lips, Do-kyun asked if he had offended them somehow. The blonde asked in shock again. Do-kyun tried to explain, but the boy exploded with accusations, perceiving these words as outright mockery. Jin stepped forward and coldly asked what guilt had to do with it at all. Do-kyun directly asked his friends why they had become so uncomfortable in his company. The redhead guiltily lowered his eyes, and the girl admitted. They thought he was simply tired of communicating with them. The boy blinked in shock. The girl recalled how sharply his attitude changed. From quiet but friendly, he suddenly became completely cold. He no longer smiled like before, and during conversations, he had a face as if he was tired of everything. To all her inquiries, he answered dryly that nothing had happened, and only got irritated by attempts to get into his soul. She barely held back tears, deciding that he simply wanted to end their friendship. Do-kyun froze. A painful memory flashed in his mind. A frightened mother clutching her heart right at the dining table. The puzzle came together. Only now did he understand the real reason for her fear back then. Walking alone, he once again accepted a simple truth. It is impossible to influence other people. This rule always applied to everyone, with one exception. His brother Hyson, whose sincerity once truly touched him deeply. Memories threw him back to childhood, where little Do-kyun was choking with tears in a dark hospital ward. But no matter how much he cried or begged, the cold figures of his parents mercilessly moved away. They simply abandoned him and returned to Korea. Then in the hospital, he was left completely alone, and that was the end of it. However, now, even when he did not cry, and did not try to attract attention, any little thing in his behavior caused instant interest. The thoughts were cut off. He stepped forward, suddenly realizing the full power of a complete soul. The boy stopped in front of Jean and Nicholas, lowered his eyes guiltily, and quietly admitted his mistake.